of Samandra had not yet settled when the first cracks appeared in the foundation of everything Orhan Sahib had built. Victory, as every commander who has ever lived long enough to reflect upon it understands, is not a destination, it is a doorway. And the room on the other side of that doorway is never empty. It is always occupied by the consequences that victory itself creates. Consequences that arrive uninvited and unwelcome and impossible to run away. Consequences that demand to be fed and housed and reckoned with. Consequences that multiply in the dark the way rats multiply in a granary, silently, relentlessly, until the grain that was meant to sustain an army has been consumed by the very creatures that the grain attracted. Orhan Sahib stood in the governor's chamber of the conquered fortress and studied the map that had been spread across the table by Mustafa, a map that showed the road to the coast in the east and the approaches from the south where Shahanshah's response would inevitably come, and the supply lines stretching back to Bursa like the veins of an arm extended. The map told him everything he needed to know and nothing he wanted to hear. Samandra was a prize, but prizes must be held, and holding requires men, and men require food and water and weapons and the thousand small necessities that transform a conquered fortress from a trophy into a functioning military installation. Every soldier stationed here was a soldier not stationed somewhere else. Every barrel of grain shipped to Samandra was a barrel not stored in Bursa. Every decision had a cost, and the costs were accumulating with the relentless arithmetic of a war that had no intention of ending simply because one wall had fallen. Abdul Rahman entered the chamber with dust still coating his armor, and the particular weariness of a man who has not slept in 2 days etched into every line of his face. The breach has been reinforced with timber and packed earth, he reported. It will hold against anything short of a sustained bombardment. The cistern is intact. Water supply is adequate for a garrison of 200 for 6 weeks. Food stores are less encouraging. The governor apparently believed in light provisioning. We have perhaps 3 weeks of grain if we ration carefully. 3 weeks, Orhan Sahib repeated, and the words tasted like sand. Mustafa, who had been studying the map with the intensity of a man trying to read the future in ink and parchment, looked up and said, "My Sultan, there is another concern. The soldiers who escaped through the western postern, we recovered 6 of them. The rest, perhaps 70 or 80 men, scattered into the countryside. They will reach Shahanshah's territory within days. Within a week, Shahanshah will know not only that Samandra has fallen, but how it fell, from which direction, with what forces, and through which weakness. Every advantage we gained through surprise will evaporate." Orhan Sahib nodded. He had already calculated this. He had known, even as the wall came down, that the clock had started ticking. The question was not whether Shahanshah would respond, but when and how and with what force and from which direction. And the answer to those questions would determine whether Samandra was the beginning of an empire or the beginning of a trap. "Send word to Bursa," the Sultan said. "Aladdin is to reinforce the garrison there, pull the reserves from Bilisik if necessary. I want the walls manned and the stores filled and the gates secured, and send a rider to Turhan. I want him scouting the southern approaches. Every road, every pass, every goat track that leads from Shahanshah's territory to ours. If an army moves, I want to know about it before the army itself knows where it is going." The orders were dispatched, carried by riders who mounted fresh horses and disappeared into the morning with the urgency of men who understood that the messages they bore might determine the fate of a nation. And Orhan Sahib remained in the governor's chamber, alone with his map and his thoughts and the persistent, gnawing awareness that he was playing a game whose rules were being rewritten by his opponents even as he played it. What he did not know, what he could not know, was that the rules had already been rewritten. That Shahanshah's plan was not merely a response to Samandra, but a fundamental reimagination of the conflict itself. That while Orhan studied the southern approaches and prepared for the army he expected to come from the direction he expected it to come from, the actual threat was being assembled in a direction he had not considered, along a route he had not scouted, with a purpose he had not imagined. And at the heart of that purpose, like the worm at the center of a beautiful fruit, was Mahmud. Mahmud, whose silence had been noted by Shahanshah in the courtyard of Ejani. Mahmud, whose response, "I was merely thinking, I was lost in my own thoughts," had been accepted at face value by Damir Khan, but not by Shahanshah. because Shahanshah was a man who understood that silence in a room full of talkers is either the mark of a fool or the mark of a man with something to hide. And Mahmud was not a fool. Mahmud had been placed within Damir Khan's inner circle years ago, not as a spy in the conventional sense, but as something more subtle and more dangerous, a seed planted in fertile ground and watered with patience and left to grow until its roots were so deep and its branches so widespread that removing it would destroy the very earth it grew in. Shahanshah had recruited him not through coercion or bribery, but through the most effective method of all, through the careful identification and exploitation of a grievance so deeply held that the man who carried it had stopped recognizing it as a grievance and had begun to see it as an identity. Mahmud's grievance was simple. He had been overlooked. Year after year, campaign after campaign, he had served with distinction and received nothing in return but a pat on the shoulder and a promise that his time would come. He had watched lesser men promoted above him. He had watched men with half his skill and a fraction of his loyalty elevated to positions of authority that should have been his. He had swallowed his resentment the way a sick man swallows medicine, grimacing with each dose, telling himself that patience was a virtue and loyalty was its own reward, until the day he realized that patience was not a virtue but a cage and loyalty was not a reward but a chain, and the men he served did not see him as a valued comrade but as a comrade but as a convenient tool, useful when needed and forgotten when not.
Peace be upon you, dear ones. Let every soul among you fall still. Let every breath slow. Let every heartbeat quiet itself beneath the weight of what is about to unfold. For tonight, history does not merely speak. Tonight, history bleeds. In the shadow of the great fortress of Ajani, three figures emerged from behind iron-studded doors into the pale light of a courtyard choked with the smell of stone and old fire. Shahanshah walked first, his robes heavy, his eyes heavier still, and behind him came Damir Khan, whose jaw was set like the edge of an anvil, and beside him strode Mahmud, quieter than either of them, his gaze cast downward as though the ground itself whispered warnings only he could hear. They had been inside for hours. The meeting with the Pope's envoy had stretched long past the hour of patience, past the hour of reason, into a territory where ambition and faith tangled together like roots beneath a dying tree. Damir Khan spoke first. His voice carried the rust of a man who had spent too many years negotiating with men he did not trust. The Pope's purpose, he said, is clear. He seeks a Christian alliance, a unity forged in the name of the cross. After the coming war, this alliance will yield us a harvest beyond reckoning. His words hung in the cold air, and Shahanshah slowed his stride, turning just enough that the torchlight caught the amusement creeping into his features. You wish to swim in every river, Shahanshah said, and you wish your treasury to overflow with the gold of every province you touch. Damir Khan did not flinch. He met the emperor's gaze without blinking and said, "Let the blood flow and let my treasury fill as well." Sultan Shahanshah, why should it not? And at this Shahanshah laughed. It was not a kind laugh. It was the laugh of a man who has watched too many allies become enemies and too many enemies become corpses. "Fill it," he said. "We cast no eye upon your coffers. Our concern is elsewhere." But Damir Khan was not finished. He let the silence stretch a single breath longer than was comfortable, then said, "I know that, but Mahmud Sahab's eye, I think, rests upon different things entirely." Mahmud, who had been walking as though asleep, lifted his head. His voice was low, almost offended, almost wounded. "What did you say, Damir Khan Sahab?" And Shahanshah, ever the predator sensing blood in still water, turned fully now and said, "Is there something we do not know, Mahmud Sahab?" "You have been too quiet." Mahmud shook his head, but the shake was slow, unconvincing. "No," he said, "I was merely thinking. I was lost in my own thoughts." And Shahanshah studied him the way a hawk studies a field mouse and said nothing more, but his silence said everything. Then the sound of running boots shattered the moment. A soldier came sprinting across the courtyard, his armor clanking, his breath ragged, and before he could even properly salute, the words tumbled out of him like stones from a broken wall. "Damir Khan Sahab, Dursun Sahab has escaped." The effect of those words was immediate and volcanic. Damir Khan's face transformed. The measured diplomat vanished, and in his place stood something feral, something ancient and furious. He seized the soldier by the collar with both fists, lifting him nearly off the ground. How he roared, and his voice echoed off the fortress walls like thunder trapped in a canyon. "How did he escape? You men cannot hold a single bound prisoner. How do you let a chained man slip through your fingers like water?" The soldier, choking against the grip on his throat, gasped out the words that only deepened the wound. Halima Khatun reached him first. She came to his aid, and Albay turned to their side immediately. He helped them. Damir Khan released the soldier with a shove that sent him stumbling backward. "Get out of my sight," he snarled. And as the soldier scrambled away, Damir Khan turned to Shahanshah, and now his voice was different. Now it was quiet. Now it was the voice of a man making calculations that would cost lives. "Dursun," he said, and the name came out like poison on his tongue. "Dursun, who shares our blood. Dursun, whose nature is that of a dog. If he has turned even one of my commanders to his side, he will not stop. This dog will sow division. He will plant seeds of doubt in every tent, in every council, in every heart that wavers. Shahanshah nodded slowly, and when he spoke, his voice carried the finality of a judge passing sentence. Then consider him your brother no longer. Without mercy, without hesitation, his head must be separated from his body. It is not a choice, it is a duty. And Damir Khan repeated the word as though carving it into stone. A duty, yes, it is a duty. And so it was spoken, and so it was sealed, there in the courtyard of Ijani, beneath a sky that offered no stars and no comfort. But far from that fortress, far from the torchlight and the scheming and the cold mathematics of betrayal, a different scene unfolded in the depths of the forest, where the trees grew so thick that even the moonlight had to fight its way through. Yakid rode alone. His horse moved slowly, picking its way through roots and fallen branches, and the only sound was the soft crunch of hooves on dead leaves and the distant, mournful cry of a night bird that seemed to know what grief was. He came to a clearing, and in that clearing stood a mound of earth, simple and unmarked save for a cloth draped across it, a cloth that had once belonged to a woman who had held him when the world was young, and the future was something to be hoped for rather than feared. He dismounted. He did not tie his horse. He simply let the reins fall as though even the beast understood that this was sacred ground. He walked to the grave and lowered himself to his knees, and for a long moment he simply knelt there, breathing. Then he reached down and lifted a handful of the soil, letting it sift through his fingers, watching the grains fall like the seconds of a life that had been stolen too soon. And then he saw the cloth, his mother's cloth, draped across the mound as though someone had placed it there with tenderness, or perhaps as though no one had cared enough to remove it. He reached for it, and when his fingers touched the fabric, something inside him cracked open. "Mother," he whispered, and his voice was the voice of a boy, not a warrior, not a commander, not a man forged in the furnace of ambition and loss. "You used to tell me never to let my anger master me. You would hold my face in your hands and tell me that rage was a fire that consumed the vessel before it ever reached the enemy. But those who put you in this barren earth, those who laid you in this cold and merciless ground, they have torn my heart from my chest. They have ripped it out, and in its place, they have set a burning coal that will never cool." He gripped the cloth tighter, pulling it against his chest as though he could absorb whatever remained of her warmth, whatever ghost of her love still lingered in the fibers. "This barren land," he said, and now his voice was changing, hardening, becoming something that the night itself seemed to recoil from. "This barren land is my witness, Mother. I will send to the depths of hellfire every soul that did this to you. Their cries for mercy will cross mountains and valleys. Their pleas will echo across ridges and through gorges, and no one will answer. No one. Because mercy died when they buried you here, in this cold soil, without honor, without ceremony, without the respect that your life demanded." He pressed the cloth to his forehead, and his next words were not a whisper. They were an oath, a vow spoken to the earth and the sky and the unseen world that stands between the living and the dead. "I will drench the ground and the heavens with the blood of those who did this. I swear it upon your grave. I swear it upon every breath I have left. I swear it." And the forest heard him, and the earth received his vow, and somewhere in the darkness the wind shifted, as though even nature understood that what had been promised could not be undone. Meanwhile, in the warmth and quiet of the palace at Bursa, the world turned on a different axis. Sultan Orhan Sahib sat beside the cradle of his youngest child, watching the infant sleep with the particular intensity of a man who knows that the world he will leave behind is not yet safe enough for the ones who must inherit it. The room was lit by a single oil lamp, and the shadows it cast were soft and gentle, unlike the shadows that waited outside these walls. "My Murad," Orhan whispered, leaning closer, letting his breath warm the small face of his son. "You are fortunate beyond measure. You will grow beside your cousin brother. You will know the bond of blood and brotherhood that is the only fortress no siege engine can breach." And for a moment, just a moment, the Sultan was not a sultan. He was simply a father, marveling at the miracle of a life he had helped bring into being. Then the door opened, and Nilofer entered. She moved into the room with the quiet grace of a woman who has learned to carry her pain like a second skin, visible only to those who know where to look. "My Sultan," she said, and her voice carried the careful neutrality of someone choosing every word as though it were a step across thin ice. "I did not expect you to come here." Orhan Sahib looked up from the cradle and said, "When have I ever been distant from you and my children, Nilofer? When have I not come?" And there was no reproach in his voice, only a genuine question, but Nilofer heard something else in it. She heard the echo of all the nights he had not come, all the mornings he had left before dawn, all the silences that had grown between them like moss on stone. "Your household," she said, "and your children by that carton, they do not want me. Is that not reason enough for separation?" And the word hung in the air between them, heavy as iron, and Orhan Sahib's expression shifted. "They are children," he said. "You will teach them what is right. Do not become the cause of division yourself." Nilofer's eyes flashed. "Am I the one causing division?" she asked, and now her voice was no longer careful. Now it was the voice of a woman who has swallowed too many words for too many years. Am I? Orhan Sahib said, is this not enough, Nilofer? And she took a step closer, and the lamplight caught the moisture gathering at the edges of her eyes. You risked your life for that carton, she said. You threw yourself into danger for her sake. The Sultan's voice dropped, and when he spoke it was with the quiet authority that had ended arguments in council chambers and silenced dissent in war tents. The one you call that carton, he said, is my wife. And Nilofer, hearing the finality in his tone, took a breath and changed her approach. Her voice steadied, her spine straightened. Very well, she said, but look around you, Orhan. Shahanshah has been removed from his throne. Mahida is gone from this world. Send a sporcher away from us. Send her anywhere, Karahisar, Bilesik, on political grounds if you must, but she is your wife. Fine, then let her be your wife somewhere else. Keep her away from us. And Orhan Sahib stared at her, and the silence stretched until the lamp flickered. Do you know what you are saying, Nilofer? He asked. Do not speak like this again. Control yourself. And he rose from his seat and walked to the far corner of the room where a small ornate box sat upon a wooden chest. He lifted it, turned it in his hands for a moment as though weighing something far heavier than the box itself, and then walked toward the door. As he passed Nilofer, he paused, and without looking at her he said, because you are very different from the Nilofer I once knew. And then he was gone, and the door closed behind him, and Nilofer stood alone in the lamplight with her son sleeping in the cradle and the weight of her own words pressing down upon her like a sentence she had passed upon herself. Elsewhere in the palace, in a warmer room where laughter still remembered how to live, Gonya held her infant son against her chest, and around her stood the small constellation of family that the wars and betrayals of the world had not yet managed to scatter. Halima was there, and Dursun stood nearby, his shoulders still carrying the tension of a man who had only recently escaped captivity, and Orhan Sahib entered with the easy stride of a brother, returning to the only place where rank did not matter. Halima looked at the child, and her face softened in a way that the battlefield never allowed. Your aunt loves you very much, she murmured to the infant, little beautiful man. And then she turned to Dursun with bright eyes and said, look how beautiful he is, Dursun, look at this face. Gonya smiled and extended the child toward Halima. Here, she said, hold him. And Halima took the baby into her arms with the natural grace of a woman who understood that some things in this world were still worth protecting, still worth fighting for, still worth dying for. Dursun watched and said quietly, the child looks well in your arms. And then Orhan entered and the room shifted. Orhan was a man who carried joy and gravity in equal measure, and now seeing his sister holding his nephew, he paused in the doorway and said, is that so, Dursun? Dursun turned and bowed his head slightly. Mashallah, Orhan Sahib, the child looks exactly like you. Orhan raised an eyebrow, genuinely pleased. Does he really? And Dursun nodded, absolutely. But Halima shook her head with the stubbornness of a sister who would never concede a point to her brother, not even in jest. No, she said firmly, he looks just like me. Look at him. He looks like my mother, which means he looks like his aunt, which means he looks like me. Look at this face. Tell me I am wrong. Orhan crossed the room and put his hand gently on Halima's shoulder. My beautiful sister, he said softly. My dear sister, you were just like this once. When did you grow up? And there was something in his voice, something tender and aching, the recognition that time had passed and could not be called back, that the girl he had once protected had become a woman who protected others. And then, because Orhan was also a man who understood the value of well-timed cruelty disguised as humor, he turned to Dursun and said, so tell me, Dursun, does Kiza look more like Halima or more like me? Dursun froze, his mouth opened and closed. He looked from Orhan to Halima and back again, and the expression on his face was that of a man who has just realized he is standing between two armies and holding no weapon. He stammered, he stalled, and then with the desperation of a cornered animal, he said, I just remembered, Jakutai Sahib was calling for me. I should go see what he needs. And he turned and fled the room with a speed that would have been impressive on a battlefield. Behind him, Orhan laughed. This boy, he said, shaking his head, he panicked so quickly. Halima looked at her brother with gentle reproach. Show him some kindness, brother, some mercy, he deserves it. Orhan's smile faded into something warmer, something real. I can show him kindness, he said, but you cannot. He paused, letting the implication settle. Then he reached for his son. Give me my child. And as he lifted the boy, he said, come, let us eat. My brother wants everyone at the table tonight. Gonya felt the shift in his tone and asked, is everything all right? Has something happened? And Halima echoed her concern, asking, is everything well, brother? But Orhan did not answer either of them. He simply held his son close and murmured to the infant in words too soft for anyone else to hear and walked toward the door, and the women followed, and the questions hung unanswered in the air like smoke from a fire that had not yet been lit. In the forest that night, the darkness wore a different face. A Byzantine soldier crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at his armor, blood streaming from a wound on his shoulder, his breath coming in ragged gasps that the trees swallowed without pity. He ran because running was all he knew how to do. He ran because behind him lay the ruin of a failed mission, and ahead of him lay the possibility, however slim, of survival. He did not see Turhan until it was too late. Turhan stepped out from behind an ancient oak as though the tree itself had given birth to him. He was massive, his frame blocked the moonlight, his hand moved in a single devastating arc, and the open-palmed blow caught the Byzantine across the face with a sound like a mallet striking wet leather. The soldier spun and crashed to the ground, his sword flying from his grip, his helmet rolling away into the darkness. "Where were you going?" Turhan asked, and his voice was calm, almost conversational, which made it infinitely more terrifying than any shout would have been. Before the soldier could answer, Cantrali burst from the shadows, his own blade drawn, fury in his eyes. He lunged toward the fallen Byzantine, ready to open his throat, but Turhan's arm shot out and caught him across the chest. "Stay away from him, Cantrali Baha. The commander wants this one alive. I want him alive, because dead men cannot speak, and this one has words inside him that we need." The Byzantine, to his credit, was not finished. He scrambled to his feet, blood pouring from his split lip, and charged at Turhan with the desperate courage of a man who knows he is going to die but refuses to die kneeling. Turhan met him head-on. What followed was not a fight, it was a demonstration. Turhan caught the soldier's first swing on his forearm, redirected it, and drove his knee into the man's midsection. The soldier doubled over. Turhan hit him again, an overhand blow to the back of the neck that drove him face first into the dirt. The soldier rose. Turhan put him down again. The soldier rose once more, swaying, blood dripping from his nose and mouth, and Turhan watched him with something that might have been respect, or might have been patience, the patience of a man who has all night and knows it. Cantrali, watching from the side, asked, "What are you going to do with him? Are you going to kill him?" And Turhan shook his head slowly. "He will not die," Turhan said, "until he tells us every weakness, every crack, every shadow entrance, every unguarded stretch of wall in the fortress of Samandra, every loose stone, every sleeping guard, every gate that groans when it opens. Cantrali, pick him up. We will make him talk." Cantrali grabbed the beaten soldier by his armor and hauled him upright, pinning his arms from behind. Turhan stepped close, grabbed the man by the jaw, and forced his head up so that their eyes met. "Speak," Turhan said, and the word was not a request. It was an inevitability. "Tell me about Samandra's weaknesses. Tell me everything. Because the alternative is a night longer than any night you have ever known, and a dawn you will not live to see." The soldier's eyes darted left and right, searching for escape, searching for mercy, searching for anything that might save him from what was coming. He found nothing. And in the darkness of that forest, with the trees standing as silent witnesses and the moon hiding its face behind a wall of cloud, the interrogation began. Back in Bursa, as night settled fully upon the palace like a cloak drawn over the shoulders of the world, the household gathered at the dining table. The dastarchin had been laid with care, bread and meat and salt, and the quiet formality of a family that knows its unity is both its greatest strength and its most vulnerable target. Every seat was filled, every face was present, and it was a sporcher who spoke first, turning to Dursun with eyes full of a sympathy that was genuine and unguarded. "What happened to you and Halima," she said, "wounded us deeply. You are brave, Dursun Saheb. You have shown courage that many who claim the title of warrior have never possessed." And Dursun lowered his head, because the praise of a good woman is sometimes harder to bear than the blow of an enemy. Then Khalil spoke, and when Khalil spoke, the room always quieted, because Khalil was a man who carried the words of God the way other men carried swords, with precision and purpose, and the knowledge that what he wielded could cut deeper than any steel. "Allah the Almighty," he said, "has commanded in Surah Al-Imran that the believers should never take disbelievers as allies instead of believers, and whoever does so will have no connection with Allah whatsoever." He paused, letting the weight of the revelation settle into every heart in the room. "Do not grieve, Dursun Saheb," he continued, "because before you stands your father and your brother. You are on the righteous path, do not doubt it, do not waver from it." Dursun lifted his head and said, "Thank you, Khalil Saheb." And then the Sultan spoke, and his words were the words of a man who has learned that encouragement given at the right moment can be worth more than 1,000 soldiers on the field. "On this path of truth," he said, "your victory will come. God willing, it will come." Dursun's voice was steady when he responded, "Thank you, my Sultan. My brother and my father have placed their grace upon my head. But they will never be strong enough to turn me from this road. Whatever they do, wherever they go, however far they push, they will find that I have not moved, that I cannot be moved." And then from beyond the doors a voice called out, Jakutai's voice, unmistakable in its particular blend of formality and barely contained energy. "May I enter, my Sultan?" And the Sultan said, "Enter, Jakutai Saheb," and the doors swung wide. 3 men walked in. Jakutai came first, his stride carrying the peculiar confidence of a man who is perpetually certain that whatever room he enters is better for his presence. Behind him came Evrenos, tall and silent, a flower pinned to his chest with a care that spoke of something beyond mere decoration. And behind Evrenos came Nasser Chalabi, whose quiet competence was the foundation upon which many of the campaign's logistics rested. The room reacted. Fatima, who had been sitting with the composed stillness of a young woman raised in a household of warriors, looked up when Evrenos entered, and something crossed her face, something quick and bright, like sunlight flashing off a drawn blade. and Evrenos, whose eyes found her immediately, as though the room contained only one person worth seeing, held her gaze for a heartbeat that lasted longer than any heartbeat should. Jarkutai, meanwhile, was doing what Jarkutai always did. He was making his presence felt. He moved through the room like a warm wind, grasping hands, exchanging greetings, pulling reluctant soldiers into embraces they had not requested and could not escape. Each one received a hearty salam, each one received a grip that could have crushed walnuts, and each one received the full force of Jarkutai's inexhaustible goodwill, which was in its own way as formidable as Turhan's fists. The three men came to stand before the Sultan, and they offered their salam with the practiced grace of men who had done so many times in many places under many different skis. Orhan Sahib regarded them with the quiet attention that was his hallmark and said simply, "Is all well?" Jarkutai said, "We have arrived safely, my Sultan. By God's grace we are here and we are well." The Sultan nodded and said, "Speak then." But before Jarkutai could begin, Malhan turned to her daughter and said, "Fatima, my daughter, please offer our guests some sherbet." And Fatima, who had been very carefully not looking at Evrenos, said, "Of course, mother." She rose with the deliberate grace of someone acutely aware that every eye in the room might be upon her, and moved to the tray where the crystal cup stood filled with the rose-scented drink that was the household's traditional offering of welcome. She carried the tray with steady hands, and she served each man in turn, and each man thanked her, and if her fingers lingered a fraction of a moment longer when she handed the cup to Evrenos, and if his fingers touched hers as he accepted it, and if both of them felt the contact like a spark struck from flint, no one mentioned it. Or if they did notice, they had the wisdom to keep their observations sealed behind their teeth. Fatima returned to her seat, and the Sultan said, "I am listening, Jarkutai Sahib." And here was where the evening tilted. Jarkutai fell silent. The easy confidence that had carried him through his entrance, through his greetings, through his handshakes and embraces, suddenly abandoned him. He looked at Evrenos. Evrenos looked back with the patience of a man who has already accepted his fate and is simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. Jarkutai opened his mouth, closed it. The silence in the room thickened like honey poured into still water. Every person at that table felt the shift. Every person understood that whatever Jarkutai had come to say, it was not military intelligence, it was not a battle plan, it was not a report from the frontier, it was something else entirely. And then, because Jarkutai was constitutionally incapable of navigating an uncomfortable silence without filling it with something, anything, he turned to Malhan and said with a brightness that was 3 shades too enthusiastic, "How are you, Malhan Khartan? You are well, inshallah. Mashallah, your face is glowing like divine light." Malhan, whose instincts were as sharp as any commander's, smiled graciously and said, "Thank you, Jarkutai Sahib, you look well yourself." And Jarkutai said, thank you," and then turned toward Alauddin with the desperate energy of a man throwing lifelines in every direction. "The noble vizier of Bursa," he declared, "our precious commander Alauddin Sahib, how are you? Are you well? You look magnificent. Is your health satisfactory?" Alauddin, who had been watching this performance with growing impatience and dawning understanding, cut through the pleasantries like a sword through silk. "Did you come here to ask how we are, Jarkutai Sahib?" he said. "Say what you came to say." And Jarkutai fell silent again and looked at Evrenos again, and the room held its breath. It was Qasim who broke the spell. The boy stood up from his seat with the abruptness of youth, and Nilofer reached for him, saying, "Sit down, son. Where are you going?" And Qasim, with the devastating clarity that only children possess, said, "Can you not see, mother? They have come to propose Fatima Aunt's marriage. I will stand with the men's side, and when the war that is surely coming begins, I will support Evrenos Sahib personally." And with that declaration, delivered with all the solemnity of a general announcing his allegiance, Qasim walked around the table and sat himself directly behind Evrenos, crossing his arms with an air of finality that would have been comical if it had not been so earnest. Asportia, not to be outdone in matters of allegiance and loyalty, rose from her own seat and said, "If you will permit me, I too will stand on the men's side, so that you will not feel alone, Evrenos Sahib." And Evrenos, whose composure had held firm through every battle, through every siege, through every desperate night march, felt something shift in his chest and murmured, "By God's grace," and meant it more than he had meant almost anything in recent memory. Jarkutai leaned toward Evrenos and whispered with genuine relief, "Do not worry, our numbers are growing. This will be much easier than we thought." And then finally, mercifully, the Sultan spoke. "Move forward, Jarkutai Sahib," he said, "say what you have come to say." And in his voice was something that might have been amusement, and might have been encouragement, and was certainly the authority of a man who understood that even in the midst of war, even on the eve of campaigns that would redraw the map of the known world, life insisted on asserting its own priorities. And their beloved ones at that precise moment, when the words hung unspoken and the room trembled on the edge of something new, when Jarkutai gathered his courage and Evrenos steadied his heart, and Fatima kept her eyes on her hands in her lap while her pulse hammered like a war drum against her ribs, there we pause, there we draw breath, there we step back from the threshold. Because beyond the walls of that room, Orhan was still extracting secrets from the bleeding mouth of a Byzantine soldier in a forest that smelled of pine and terror, because in a clearing not far from there, Yakid knelt beside his mother's grave with an oath of blood burning on his lips like a brand, because in the fortress of Ijani, Damir Khan was sharpening a blade meant for Dursun's neck, while Shahanshah plotted the movements of armies that had not yet marched. Because Mahmud, quiet Mahmud, carried a secret behind his silence that would, when it finally emerged, shake the foundations of alliances that men believed were built on stone but were in truth built on sand. The sherbet grew warm in the cups, the lamplight flickered against the walls. Somewhere outside, a horse stamped its hoof against the stable floor, impatient, restless, sensing what was coming the way animals always sense what is coming before men do. The night deepened. The stars turned their ancient wheel above a world that did not deserve their beauty but received it anyway. And in every corner of that world, in every fortress and every forest and every palace and every grave, the war that was not yet finished whispered its promise to every soul that would listen. This is not the end, this is not even the middle. This is merely the breath between blows, the silence between the thunder and the lightning, the heartbeat between the raising of the sword and its fall. Every oath sworn tonight will be tested. Every alliance forged tonight will be weighed. Every betrayal planted tonight will bear its bitter fruit. And when the dawn comes, and it will come, though it may not come kindly, and it may not come gently, and it may not bring the mercy that men pray for in the dark hours when their courage falters, when that dawn comes, every soul that stands in its light will know whether they chose wisely or whether they chose only what was easy. The war is not over, the war has barely begun, and those who believe they stand on solid ground will discover when the earth begins to shake that the ground beneath them was never solid at all. It was waiting, as it has always been waiting, as it waits now even as these words reach you, even as the dark presses close and the fire burns low and the world holds its breath for what comes next. Remember this night, remember these faces, remember these words, because every one of them carries the weight of what is to come, and what is to come will spare no one. Until we meet again in the next chapter, in the next breath of this unending story, keep these souls in your prayers, keep this tale in your hearts, and know, beyond any shadow of doubt, that the blade that has been drawn cannot be sheathed until it has tasted what it was drawn to taste. The war is not over, it calls to us from the horizon, and we will answer. The column moved through the darkness like a serpent through tall grass, each segment connected to the next by the invisible thread of discipline and shared purpose that separates an army from a mob. The sound of their passage was surprisingly restrained for so large a force, boots falling on packed earth with the muffled rhythm of a heartbeat heard through a wall, armor shifting and settling with the soft metallic whisper of scales on a sleeping dragon, and beneath it all the deep resonant groan of the siege engines being dragged along the dry riverbed on wheels wrapped in leather to silence their passage. Orhan Sahib had not spoken since the march began. He rode at the front with his back straight and his eyes forward and the reins loose in his hands, trusting his horse the way he trusted his instincts, the way he trusted the men behind him, the way he trusted the God above him who had never promised easy victories but had always promised that the righteous would not be abandoned. Beside him rode a Lordin, whose silence was of a different quality, not the silence of contemplation, but the silence of a man running calculations in his head, logistics and contingencies and worst-case scenarios that spiraled outward like ripples in a pond struck by a stone. And behind them both rode Khalil, whose lips moved in continuous prayer, a murmur so soft it might have been mistaken for breathing, a conversation with the divine conducted in the language of the desperate and the faithful, which are often the same language. The forest closed around them as they descended into the riverbed. The canopy overhead blocked what little moonlight remained, and the darkness became absolute, the kind of darkness that presses against the eyes like cloth, the kind that makes a man question whether his eyes are open or closed, the kind that forces the other senses to sharpen until every sound becomes a symphony and every smell becomes a story. The earth beneath them smelled of clay and ancient water and the decomposed leaves of 1,000 autumns. The air tasted of iron and pine resin and something else, something acrid and faint that might have been the distant memory of fire. Abdul Rahman worked at the rear with his engineers, and the work was brutal. The riverbed narrowed in places where centuries of erosion had carved the banks into steep walls of compacted stone and root, and the siege engines, massive wooden structures designed for open terrain, had to be partially dismantled and carried through on the shoulders of men who strained and sweated and cursed under their breath and did not stop. Abdul Rahman moved among them like a father among stubborn children, correcting, encouraging, occasionally seizing a timber himself, and hauling it through a gap that his men had declared impassable, proving through action what words could never prove, that no task was beneath a commander who understood that the difference between victory and defeat often came down to whether a ram arrived at the wall on time or an hour too late. 2 hours before midnight, Turhan appeared at the Sultan's side as though the forest had simply produced him. He rode no horse, he carried no torch, he materialized from the darkness with the ease of a man who has spent so many years in the wild that the boundary between himself and the wilderness has become theoretical. "My Sultan," he said, and his voice was pitched so low that only Orhan could hear him. "Tamir Boga's riders have reached the northern ridge. 6 sentries on the watchtower, as the prisoner said, 2 awake, 4 sleeping. Tamir Boga requests permission to take the tower at the second watch change when all 6 will be gathered in the same room." Orhan Sahib considered this for exactly 3 breaths. Then he said, "Granted. No survivors from the tower, no signal fires, no warning horns. I want Samandra deaf and blind when the rams begin." Turhan nodded once and vanished back into the darkness with the same silence that had brought him. The column pressed on. At the northern ridge, a mile and a half from the column's position, Tamir Boga lay on his stomach in the wet grass, watching the watchtower through the darkness with the unblinking patience of a predator. The tower was a squat stone structure, 3 stories high, with a signal fire platform at its summit and a single wooden door at its base. The door was closed but unbarred, because the sentries had grown complacent in the way that men grow complacent when they have watched the same empty landscape for months without incident, and have begun to believe unconsciously, fatally, that the landscape will remain empty forever. Tamir Boga had positioned his men in a semicircle around the base of the tower, 20 riders dismounted and moving on foot, their horses held by handlers a quarter-mile back, their swords drawn and their breathing controlled and their eyes fixed on their commander, waiting for the signal. The signal would be simple. Tamir Boga would rise from the grass, that was all. When he rose, they would move. When they moved, the tower would fall. When the tower fell, Samandra would lose its eyes on the northern approach, and the siege would begin with the advantage of surprise, which in war is an advantage worth more than 1,000 extra soldiers. The minutes crawled past like wounded men dragging themselves across a battlefield. The moon hid, the stars watched, the wind moved through the grass with a sound like whispered conspiracy, and inside the tower the second watch change began. Tamir Boga could hear the sounds of men waking, the scrape of boots on stone, the muttered complaints of soldiers roused from sleep, the clink of a water flask passed from hand to hand. He counted the sounds, he mapped the movements in his mind. He waited until the sounds told him that all 6 men were on the same level of the tower, gathered in the middle floor where the watch change traditionally occurred, and then he rose. 20 shadows converged on the tower door. The first man through the door was a warrior named Kulad, a giant of a man whose specialty was close-quarters combat in confined spaces, and he hit the interior of the tower like a boulder dropped from a height. The sounds that followed were brief and terrible, the clash of steel on steel, a shout cut short, the heavy wet sound of a body hitting stone, another shout, this one more a scream than a shout, also cut short, and then silence. A silence that was absolute and final, and that spoke more eloquently than any words about what had transpired within those walls. Tamir Boga entered the tower and found Kulad standing amid the fallen, his chest heaving, his blade running with blood that looked black in the darkness. 6, Kulad said, and the word was both a report and a prayer, because Kulad was a man who killed efficiently but never without cost to his own soul, and each life he took carved a notch in the part of himself that still remembered what it meant to be something other than a weapon. Tamir Boga climbed to the signal fire platform and looked out across the landscape. From this height, he could see the walls of Samandra in the distance, dark against the darker sky, and the faint glow of torches on the battlements, and the occasional movement of sentries packing their rounds with the mechanical boredom of men who had no idea that the night around them was full of steel and intention. He could also see to the southwest the faintest suggestion of movement along the dry riverbed, a darkness within the darkness that was the column approaching, and he knew that within the hour the rams would be in position, and the eastern wall would face the reckoning that had been written for it in the blood of a soldier who had broken under the heat of Turhan's iron. He sent a runner to the Sultan, tower secured, no alarm raised, northern approach clear. And then he settled in to wait, because his part was done for now, and the next act belonged to Abdul Rahman and his engineers and the massive wooden rams that even now were being reassembled in the shadow of the riverbed's banks, their iron heads fitted back onto their shafts, their wheels reattached, their frames checked and rechecked by men who understood that a ram that fails at the wall is worse than no ram at all. Meanwhile, in a place far removed from the immediate concerns of siege warfare, Yaqid sat across from Zarkan in the back room of the border tavern, and the conversation that unfolded between them was unlike any conversation that had been held in that room before. Zarkan was a man who dealt in information the way other men dealt in grain or cloth, measuring its value by its freshness and its scarcity and the desperation of the buyer. He had served many masters over the years, and his loyalty was not to any cause or faith or nation, but to the principle that information was power and power was survival and survival was the only currency that mattered in a world that killed the loyal and the treacherous with equal indifference. What you are proposing, Zarkan said slowly, turning his cup in his hands, is not revenge. What you are proposing is a declaration of war against men who have armies at their disposal and alliances that stretch across half the known world. You are one man with a grievance. The world is full of men with grievances. Most of them die forgotten. Yakid leaned forward, and the lamplight caught the angles of his face and the cold fire in his eyes. I am not most men, he said, and my mother was not most women. She was buried in barren ground without ceremony, without honor, without the prayers she deserved, by men who considered her an inconvenience, an obstacle to be removed and forgotten. They will learn that what they buried was not an obstacle, it was a seed, and what grows from that seed will strangle every vine in their garden. Zarkan studied him. He had seen many angry men in his years. He had seen men burn with rage and cool within a week, their fury spent like a fire that consumes its fuel and dies. But what he saw in Yakid's eyes was different. This was not the heat of rage. This was something colder and more patient. This was the focused intensity of a man who has converted his grief into a weapon and has no intention of laying that weapon down until it has served its purpose. You need men, Zarkan said. I need ghosts, Yakid replied. Men who can move without being seen. Men who can strike without being traced. Men who have no families, no lands, no ties that can be used against them. Men who have nothing left to lose because everything they had has already been taken. Zarkan was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I know such men, but their price is not gold. Their price is purpose. Give them a cause worth dying for and they will follow you into the mouth of hell. Give them anything less and they will slit your throat while you sleep. Then I will give them a cause, Yakid said. And he stood and he placed a single gold coin on the table, not as payment but as a symbol, a seal upon the agreement that had just been struck. Send word when they are assembled. I will be at the clearing where the old mill used to stand west of the river fork. They have 3 days. 3 days, Zarkan repeated. And then, with a thin smile that contained no warmth, he said, Your mother must have been a remarkable woman. Yakid stopped at the door. He did not turn around. She was, he said. And then he was gone, and the door closed behind him, and Zarkan sat alone in the lamplight with his untouched cup and his racing thoughts, and the uncomfortable certainty that he had just set something in motion that would outgrow every calculation he was capable of making. The night wore on, and the world divided itself into those who slept and those who could not. In the palace at Bursa, Nilofer lay awake in her chamber, staring at the ceiling, replaying the Sultan's words in her mind with the obsessive attention of a woman trying to find the moment where everything went wrong. You are very different from the Nilofer I once knew. The words cut deeper each time she returned to them because she knew they were true, and knowing they were true made them worse, not better. She had become something she did not recognize. The jealousy that had started as a small thorn in her heart had grown into a thicket that obscured everything else. Her love for Orhan, her duty to the household, her responsibility to her children, her own dignity. She had let the thorn grow because pulling it out would have required acknowledging that it was there, and acknowledging it would have required admitting that the Nilofer who had married the Sultan, the Nilofer who had been brave and generous and willing to share the burdens of leadership with grace, that Nilofer had been slowly dying, replaced by someone smaller and meaner and more afraid. She turned on her side and looked at Qasim's empty bed. The boy had insisted on sleeping in the soldiers' quarters, claiming that he needed to begin training for the campaign. He was too young. She knew he was too young, but she also knew that he was his father's son, and his father's sons did not stay young for long in this world. The wars that forged them into men also burned away the softness of childhood, and what emerged from that fire was either steel or ash, and there was no way to know which it would be until the fire had done its work. A sporcher in her own chamber could not sleep either. She sat by the window, looking out at the dark city, and her mind was 1,000 miles away, in a place where Shahanshah had once held her hand and promised her a future that had been built on lies and ambition, and the kind of love that was indistinguishable from possession. She had escaped that life. She had found refuge in this household, in the Sultan's protection, in the quiet kindness of Malhan and the fierce loyalty of Halima, and the grudging acceptance of a family that had not asked for her but had not turned her away. But escape, she was learning, was not the same as freedom. The chains that Shahanshah had placed upon her were not made of iron. They were made of memory, and memory could not be filed through or broken or left behind. Memory traveled, memory followed. Memory waited in the dark corners of the mind and emerged without warning, bringing with it the taste of old fears and the shape of old wounds that had healed on the surface but still throbbed beneath. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window and whispered a prayer, not for herself but for the men marching through the night, for the Sultan and his brothers and his captains, for Evrenos who had found love on the eve of war, for Turhan who carried the burden of violence so that others might be spared, for Dursun who had chosen the right side at the cost of everything he had known, for all of them, every one of them, marching toward a wall that would either fall or hold, and either way. Men would die and women would weep, and children would grow up without fathers, and the world would turn and turn and turn, indifferent to the suffering that turned with it. At the eastern wall of Samandra, the silence was absolute. The sentries paced their rounds, their footsteps echoing off the stone with the regularity of a clock, and the torches on the battlements cast pools of orange light that revealed nothing beyond their own flickering shadows. The governor of Samandra, a man named Killil, according to the intelligence Turhan had extracted, slept in his quarters above the main gate, secure in the belief that his walls were strong and his garrison was sufficient, and the northern watchtower was standing vigilant guard over the approaches that any attacking force would have to use. He did not know that the watchtower was a tomb now, its sentries cooling on the stone floor with their blood pooling beneath them. He did not know that the dry riverbed he had dismissed as impassable for siege engines was at this moment echoing with the muffled sounds of rams being wheeled into position. He did not know that 200 cavalry sat on the northern ridge, silent and ready, their swords drawn, waiting for the signal that would send them pouring down the slope like water through a broken dam. He did not know any of this, because the system designed to tell him these things had been systematically dismantled by men who understood that knowledge was the first casualty of any well-planned attack. He slept, and in his sleep perhaps he dreamed. And if he dreamed, perhaps his dreams were pleasant, because dreams do not know what the waking world knows, and the waking world at this moment knew something terrible and inevitable and just hours away from making itself real. Abdul Rahman positioned the first ram opposite the section of wall the prisoner had identified, the section near the cistern where the mortar had not been repaired since the earthquake. In the darkness, he ran his hands along the wall's surface, feeling for the cracks and gaps that confirmed the prisoner's testimony. He found them. The mortar crumbled at his touch, dry and powdery, weakened by water damage and neglect, and the accumulated stress of years without maintenance. He pressed his palm flat against the stone and pushed, and the stone shifted, just barely, just enough. 4 strikes, the prisoner had said. Abdul Rahman looked at the ram, looked at the wall, and made his own calculation. 3, he murmured, perhaps 2, and he stepped back and signaled his men to take their positions. The ram crew consisted of 40 men, 20 on each side of the massive timber shaft, their hands gripping the leather-wrapped handholds, their feet braced against the ground, their bodies leaning forward in the posture of men about to convert every ounce of their strength into a single point of focused destruction. The iron head of the ram gleamed dully in the darkness, shaped like a fist, designed to concentrate the force of impact into the smallest possible area, to find the cracks in the stone and drive into them like a wedge, widening them, deepening them, until the wall's own weight became its enemy and gravity did the rest. Abdul Rahman raised his hand, the crew tensed, the night held its breath. And then from the battlements above a voice called out. A sentry, restless, unable to sleep, had wandered to the eastern wall to relieve himself and had looked down into the darkness and had seen, or thought he had seen, movement below. "Who goes there?" the voice called, and the words fell into the silence like stones into still water, sending ripples that spread outward in every direction. For one terrible heartbeat, everything stopped. Abdul Rahman's hand remained raised. The ram crew remained frozen. The sentry leaned over the parapet, squinting into the darkness, trying to make sense of the shapes below, shapes that might have been shadows or might have been something else entirely. Then Turhan moved. He had been crouching at the base of the wall, invisible in the darkness, and now he moved with a speed that seemed impossible for a man of his size. He scaled the wall using handholds that would have been invisible to anyone who had not spent hours studying the wall's surface in the preceding days. He went up like a spider, silent and fast, and the sentry did not hear him until it was too late. The sentry turned at the whisper of leather on stone, and his mouth opened to shout, and Turhan's hand closed around his throat with the finality of a gate slamming shut. The shout died unborn. The sentry's eyes went wide, his hands clawed at Turhan's grip, his feet scrabbled against the stone, and then there was a sound, a small sound, unremarkable, insignificant, the sound of something essential breaking, and the sentry went limp. Turhan lowered the body to the walkway and looked down at Abdul Rahman. His hand made a single gesture, "Continue." Abdul Rahman's hand fell. The ram crew surged forward. The iron head struck the wall with a sound that tore the night apart, a deep percussive boom that resonated through the stone and the earth and the bones of every man within 100 yards. The wall shuddered, dust cascaded from the mortar lines. Cracks appeared, spiderwebbing outward from the point of impact with the terrible beauty of destruction in progress. The crew pulled back, the ram withdrew, the crew surged forward again. The second strike was harder than the first, driven by the momentum of men who had heard the wall crack and knew that one more blow might be enough. The sound was different this time, deeper, wetter, the sound of stone separating from stone, of mortar giving way, of a structure that had stood for generations beginning to understand that its time was over. From inside the fortress, shouts erupted, horns sounded, bells rang. The garrison, jolted from sleep by the sound of their own wall being beaten to death, scrambled for weapons and armor and positions on the battlements, but they were too late. They had always been too late. The moment the watchtower fell, the moment the sentry died with Turhan's hand around his throat, the outcome had been decided. Everything that followed was merely the world catching up to a conclusion that had already been written. The third strike brought the wall down. It did not collapse all at once. It sagged first, the way a man sags when his knees give out, a slow inward buckling that lasted perhaps 2 seconds but felt like an eternity. Then the upper courses shifted, sliding sideways as the mortar that held them dissolved into powder, and the weight of the stone above found nothing beneath it to rest upon, and gravity, patient and implacable, claimed its due. The wall came down with a roar that dwarfed the sound of the ram, a roar of stone and dust and centuries of history being reduced to rubble in a single catastrophic moment. Through the breach poured the warriors. They came like a river through a broken dam, armored and armed and screaming the name of God with voices that had been building toward this moment for hours, for days, for years, for the entire span of their lives. First through the breach was Turhan, who had leaped down from the battlement and landed in the rubble, and was already cutting his way through the stunned defenders before the dust had settled. Behind him came wave after wave of soldiers, their swords catching the torchlight and throwing it back in arcs of orange and silver that painted the chaos in the colors of hell. The fighting inside Samandra was close and brutal and without mercy. The corridors were narrow, the rooms were dark. The defenders, caught between sleep and death, fought with the desperate fury of men who had nowhere to retreat and nothing to gain by surrender. Steel rang against steel in a continuous cacophony that echoed off the stone walls and amplified itself until the entire fortress seemed to vibrate with the sound of combat. Turhan fought at the front, as he always did, his massive frame filling the corridors, his blade moving with an economy of motion that belied its devastating effect. Each stroke was precise, each strike was final. He did not waste energy on flourishes or displays. He killed the way a craftsman works, with focus and efficiency and the quiet satisfaction of a man doing what he was born to do. Beside him fought Cantrali, smaller and faster, darting through gaps that Turhan created, finishing what Turhan started, the two of them working together with the seamless coordination of men who have fought side by side so many times that words are unnecessary and thought is redundant, and the body simply knows what to do. The garrison fought back. They formed walls of shields in the wider corridors and tried to stem the tide, and for a few desperate minutes they succeeded, their shields locked, their spears projecting forward like the quills of a cornered porcupine. But Abdul Rahman had anticipated this. He had sent a second force through a side entrance that the prisoner had described, a small door used by servants, barely wide enough for one man to pass through at a time, and this force, led by a captain named Al-Aliaddin Saheb, emerged behind the defenders and struck them from the rear with the devastating effect of a blow that is neither seen nor expected. The shield wall broke, the defenders scattered, some threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender, some fought on preferring death to captivity and death obliged them. Some fled deeper into the fortress, searching for exits that did not exist, searching for allies who had already fallen, searching for hope in a place where hope had been extinguished as thoroughly as the signal fire on the northern watchtower that would never burn again. Governor Killil emerged from his quarters in full armor, his sword drawn, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. He had heard the wall fall, he had heard the screams. He had heard the name of God shouted by 1,000 voices in a language he did not speak, and he understood with the clarity that comes only in moments of absolute catastrophe that his fortress was lost, and his garrison was broken, and his life, which he had spent decades building through careful administration and strategic compromise, was now measured in minutes. He did not run, that much could be said for him. He planted himself at the top of the main staircase and fought every man who came up, and he fought well, his blade moving with the practiced precision of a man who had been trained in the finest military academies of Constantinople. He killed 2 attackers. He wounded 3 more. He held the staircase for nearly 5 minutes, which in the compressed timeline of a siege is an eternity, and the men who finally brought him down would later speak of his courage with the grudging respect that warriors reserve for enemies who die well. But die he did. Turhan came up the staircase last after the others had been repelled, and the fight between them was brief but magnificent. Killil lunged, Turhan deflected, Killil slashed. Turhan absorbed the blow on his arm guard, feeling the impact shudder through his bones, and responded with a single strike that found the gap between Killil's breastplate and his shoulder guard. The governor staggered, his sword arm dropped. His eyes met Turhan's, and in that final exchange of glances, something passed between them that transcended enmity and language and faith, the recognition of one warrior by another, the acknowledgement that in a different world, under different circumstances, they might have stood side by side rather than face to face. Then Turhan struck again, and the governor of Samandra fell, and the fortress was taken. The dawn that followed was the color of old bronze, a metallic light that seemed to coat every surface with a patina of exhaustion and accomplishment and the lingering residue of violence. The rubble of the eastern wall lay in great heaps, and through the breach streamed the morning light, illuminating the interior of the fortress with a clarity that was almost cruel, revealing the bodies and the blood and the broken weapons and the shattered remnants of a garrison that had awakened to find its world ending and had not been given the time to understand why. Orhan Sahib entered the fortress on foot. He walked through the breach, stepping over the rubble with the careful deliberation of a man who understands that the first steps taken in a conquered place set the tone for everything that follows. He surveyed the damage with eyes that missed nothing, the structural weaknesses that would need to be reinforced, the strategic positions that would need to be manned, the supplies that would need to be inventoried, the prisoners who would need to be processed with justice and without cruelty, because the Sultan's reputation for fairness was not merely a moral principle but a military asset, a tool that encouraged future enemies to surrender rather than fight to the death. Mustafa met him at the inner gate with a preliminary report. The garrison had numbered 312. Of those, 147 were dead, 93 were captured, and the remainder had fled through a postern gate on the western side that the prisoner had not mentioned. Mustafa had sent cavalry to pursue, but the fleeing soldiers had scattered into the countryside, and most would likely never be found. Our own losses, Mustafa said, and his voice carried the weight of the numbers he was about to speak: 31 dead, 62 wounded, 14 of those seriously. Orhan Sahib closed his eyes for a moment. 31 men, 31 families that would receive the news no family ever wants to receive, 31 empty places at 31 tables, 31 names that would be added to the long list of names that every sultan carries in his memory like stones in his pockets, growing heavier with each campaign, each battle, each victory that costs what every victory costs. See to the wounded, the sultan said, and bury the dead with full honors, ours and theirs. Every man who fell on this field fell in service to what he believed was right, and that belief deserves respect regardless of which side held it. Mustafa bowed and withdrew, and Orhan Sahib climbed to the highest point of the fortress, the signal fire platform at the top of the main tower, and looked out at the landscape that Samandra commanded. To the east, the road to the coast stretched like a pale ribbon through green hills. To the north, the ridge where Tamir Boga had taken the watchtower rose against the sky. To the west, the forest through which the column had marched lay dark and impenetrable. And to the south, invisible beyond the horizon but present in the Sultan's mind with the vividness of a map drawn in fire, lay the territories of Shahanshah, who would learn of Samandra's fall within days and would respond with everything at his disposal. The Sultan stood on that platform and felt the morning wind against his face and allowed himself for just a moment to feel the satisfaction of a plan executed well. Then he let the satisfaction go, because satisfaction was the enemy of vigilance, and vigilance was the price of survival, and the war was not over. Samandra was a victory, but victories were not ends. They were beginnings, the beginning of new responsibilities, the beginning of new threats. The beginning of the next phase of a conflict that would not end until one side or the other had been broken beyond recovery. Far to the south in the fortress of Ajani, the news arrived by messenger at midday. A soldier burst into Damir Khan's chambers with the words already forming on his lips before his knees had finished bending in the bow. Samandra has fallen. The eastern wall was breached before dawn. The garrison is destroyed. Governor Killil is dead. Damir Khan received the news the way a stone receives a blow, without visible reaction, without sound, absorbing the impact internally where it would fracture him along lines that no one else could see. He dismissed the messenger. He stood alone in his chamber for a long time, staring at the wall, seeing not stone but the future, and the future he saw was darker than any night he had ever endured. Then he went to find Shahanshah. The emperor was in the garden of all places. He sat on a stone bench beneath an almond tree that had not yet bloomed, his hands folded in his lap, his expression one of serene contemplation that would have been appropriate for a philosopher and was deeply unsettling in a man who had just lost a strategic fortress. Damir Khan approached and said without preamble, "Samandra has fallen." Shahanshah did not move, he did not flinch, he did not curse or rage or pound his fist against the stone. He simply sat, and after a moment he said, "I know." "You know?" Damir Khan's voice cracked with something between anger and incredulity. "How can you know? The messenger just arrived." Shahanshah turned his head slowly, and his eyes, when they met Damir Khan's, were the eyes of a man who has stopped reacting to events and started orchestrating them. "Because I expected it," he said, "because Samandra was designed to fall." The words landed in the space between them like a blade driven into a table, quivering, dangerous, demanding attention. Damir Khan stared. "Designed to fall," he repeated. Shahanshah rose from the bench with the unhurried grace of a man who has all the time in the world because he has already determined how the world will use its time. I told you, he said, that I would give Orhan exactly what he wants and then take it away from him. Samandra is what he wants, the road to the coast, the strategic advantage, the morale of a conquered fortress. Let him have it, let him celebrate. Let him deploy his garrison and stretch his supply lines and commit his forces to holding what he has taken. And while he is busy holding Samandra, while his eyes are fixed on the prize he thinks he has won, we will strike where he is not looking. Where Demirhan asked. Shahanshah smiled. Bursa, he said. The word fell from his lips like a stone into deep water, and the ripples spread outward, touching everything. While Orhan plays at Empire in Samandra, Shahanshah continued, Bursa will be defended by a skeleton garrison. His family will be there, his wife, his children, his mother, his household, everything he loves and everything he fights for will be sitting behind walls that were built to keep out bandits, not armies. And when we arrive at those walls with every soldier we can muster, Orhan will face a choice that no commander wants to face. Abandon Samandra and race back to defend his family, losing everything he has gained, or hold Samandra and watch his family fall into our hands. Either way he loses, either way he is destroyed, not his army, him, the man inside the armor, the heart inside the chest, the thing that makes him fight. Demirhan felt the cold weight of the plan settle over him like a shroud. It was brilliant, it was monstrous. It was exactly the kind of strategy that Shahanshah had always been capable of but had never, until now, been desperate enough to employ. And in that desperation, Demirhan saw the most dangerous version of Shahanshah he had ever encountered, a man with nothing left to lose and everything left to prove, a man who had been humiliated and dethroned, and was now prepared to burn the world to rebuild his empire from the ashes. And Mahmud, Demirhan asked, where does Mahmud stand in this? Shahanshah's smile widened. Mahmud, he said, is already where he needs to be. And that was all he would say, and the silence that followed was the silence of a secret too dangerous to speak aloud, a silence that Demirhan filled with his own imagination, and his imagination produced possibilities that made the blood in his veins run cold. The war shifted, the board tilted. The pieces moved into positions that none of the players had anticipated, except one, except the man who sat beneath an almond tree in a garden and smiled, and planned, and waited with the patience of a man who has decided that if he cannot rule the world, he will ensure that no one else can either. In the forest clearing west of the river fork, Yakid waited for the men that Zarkan had promised. He waited with his mother's cloth pressed against his chest, and his hand on his sword, and his eyes scanning the tree line with the restless intensity of a man who trusts no one and expects betrayal from every direction. The clearing was small and surrounded by ancient oaks whose trunks were wider than a man's reach, and the ground was soft with decades of fallen leaves, and the air smelled of earth and decay, and the faint, persistent sweetness of something dying. They came at dusk, not all at once but in ones and twos, emerging from the trees like ghosts, men without names and without pasts and without anything to lose. They were exactly what Yakid had asked for. They were the broken and the banished and the betrayed, men who had been discarded by the systems they had served, men who carried their grievances like weapons and wore their scars like armor. They looked at Yakid, and they saw in him a mirror of themselves, a man forged in the fire of loss, a man whose rage had been refined into purpose, and they recognized him the way wolves recognize the leader of the pack, not through rank or title but through the quality of the fury that burned behind his eyes. Yakid stood before them and said nothing for a long time. He let them see him, he let them take his measure. And then he spoke, and his voice was low and hard and carried the weight of a vow made over a mother's grave in the dark hours of a night that had changed him forever. I will not promise you glory, he said. I will not promise you gold. I will not promise you survival. What I promise you is this. The men who took everything from us will know our names. They will feel our blades. They will hear our voices in their nightmares for whatever remains of their miserable lives. And when they are gone, when they are nothing but bones in the ground and names in the histories that other men write, we will still be standing, because we are not an army, we are a reckoning. And reckonings do not end, they simply wait for the right moment, and the right moment, brothers, is now. The men said nothing, they did not cheer, they did not shout, they simply looked at him, and then one by one they drew their swords and held them point down against the earth, a silent pledge, an unspoken oath, a commitment written not in ink but in the cold gleam of steel against the fading light. Yakid looked at them, and for the first time since his mother's death, something in his face that was not rage surfaced briefly, a flicker of something that might have been gratitude, or might have been recognition, or might simply have been the relief of a man who has been carrying an unbearable weight alone and has finally found others willing to share the burden. Then the flicker vanished and the rage returned, and Yakid said, "We ride at midnight." And the clearing emptied and the forest swallowed them, and the night that followed was the darkest that part of the world had ever known, not because the moon was absent but because what moved beneath its light was something that the moon itself would have hidden from if it could. The war was not over, the war was metastasizing. What had begun as a siege had become a chess game, and what had begun as a chess game was becoming something else entirely, something that none of the players fully understood and none of them could control. Shahanshah plotted, Orhan fortified, Yaqid recruited, Damir Khan sharpened his blade, Mahmud carried his secret. Turhan cleaned the blood from his sword and prepared for the next battle, because there was always a next battle, and the next battle was always worse than the last. In Bursa, Halima held Fatima's hand and said, "When this is over, when the fighting stops and the men come home, we will celebrate your wedding with a feast that this city has never seen." And Fatima smiled, because hope is the one thing that no war has ever been able to kill, though many wars have tried. But hope, like everything else in this story, would be tested. Tested by fire, tested by steel, tested by the cold and calculated cruelty of men who have decided that if they cannot have the world, they will destroy it. The dawn is coming, but what the dawn brings is not yet decided, and those who believe they know how this story ends do not know this story at all, because this story is not about victory or defeat. This story is about the space between them, the terrible, beautiful, agonizing space where men and women make the choices that define them, not as conquerors or conquered, but as human beings standing at the edge of history and deciding, with every breath and every heartbeat and every swing of the blade, who they are and who they will become. The war is not over, it has never been over. It will not be over until the last sword is sheathed and the last prayer is spoken, and the last tear has fallen on the last grave of the last man who believed that what he fought for was worth the price of fighting. Hold your hearts, hold your prayers, hold your breath. What comes next will change everything. The night did not end when the words fell silent in that room. The night merely shifted its weight, the way a wounded animal shifts before it rises to fight again, and the darkness outside the walls of Bursa thickened until even the sentries on the ramparts could not tell where the sky ended and the earth began. Somewhere in that darkness, history was being written not with ink but with blood, not on parchment but on the skin of men who had chosen their sides and could not now unchoose them. Jakutai stood in the center of that room with every eye upon him and the silence pressing against his chest like a stone. He had faced cavalry charges. He had stood in the breach of crumbling walls with nothing between him and death but a notched sword and a prayer. But this was different. This required a courage that no battlefield could teach, the courage to speak plainly in a room full of people who would remember every word he said for the rest of their lives. He cleared his throat. He looked at Evrenos one final time, and Evrenos gave him the smallest nod, barely a movement at all, but enough. It was enough. "My Sultan," Jakutai began, and his voice had shed its earlier bluster like a snake shedding old skin. What remained was something raw and genuine and almost tender. "My Sultan, we have ridden together through storms that would have broken lesser men. We have buried friends whose names we still whisper in our prayers. We have built something in this land that our fathers dreamed of but never dared to believe they would see. And now I stand before you not as a commander, not as a strategist, not as a servant of the state, but as a man who has watched another man prove his worth 1,000 times over on the field of battle and in the quiet hours between battles when character is truly tested. Evrenos Sahib has served this cause with a devotion that I have rarely seen matched. His sword has never wavered, his loyalty has never bent, and his heart, my Sultan, his heart has found its home." The room was utterly still. Even the infants seemed to sense that something momentous was unfolding and held their small breaths. Malhan's hand found the edge of the cushion beside her and gripped it. Aladdin leaned forward almost imperceptibly. Fatima's gaze remained fixed on her own hands, but the flush rising up her neck betrayed every emotion she was trying to contain. Jakutai continued, his voice gaining strength now that the hardest words had been spoken. "We have come to ask with all humility and all respect and all the honor that this household deserves for the hand of Fatima Khatun in marriage to Evrenos Sahib. He is a man of faith, he is a man of war, he is a man of principle, and he will guard her honor the way he guards the banner of this sultanate with his life and with his last breath." Nasser Chalabi, who had been standing quietly behind the other two like a mountain behind two hills, stepped forward and added in his measured voice, "I bear witness to his character, my Sultan, on the field and off it. In victory and in the desperate hours of retreat, he has never faltered, he has never sought glory for its own sake. What he seeks now, he seeks with a pure heart." And then silence again, the kind of silence that has texture and weight and temperature, the kind of silence that presses against the eardrums until you can hear your own blood moving through your veins. Orhan Sahib looked at Jakutai, then at Nasser Chalabi, then at Evrenos, who met his gaze without flinching, without looking away, without the slightest tremor in his jaw or his hands, though inside him a storm was raging that made every battle he had ever fought feel like a summer breeze. The Sultan studied him the way he studied maps before a campaign, the way he studied terrain before committing his cavalry, the way he studied the faces of men before deciding whether they would stand beside him or betray him. He studied Evrenos for a long time. Then the Sultan turned to Malhan. Their eyes met, and in that exchange passed a conversation that required no words, a conversation built on years of shared meals and shared fears and shared prayers whispered in the dark when the children were asleep, and the weight of the world pressed down on both of them equally. Malhan's expression softened. She inclined her head just slightly, just enough. Orhan Sahib turned back to Jarkutai and said, "This is not a decision that belongs to me alone. A father may give his blessing, but a daughter's heart is her own dominion, and even a sultan does not rule there." He paused and then said, "Fatima." She looked up. Her eyes were bright with something that was not quite tears and not quite joy, but something in between, something that had no name in any language spoken by men. "Yes, my sultan," she said, and her voice was steady, because she was her mother's daughter and her father's child, and she had been raised in a house where strength was not the absence of fear but the mastery of it. "You have heard what has been spoken," Orhan Sahib said, "and I will ask you only once, and whatever answer you give will be honored. Do you consent?" The room waited, the world waited. The night outside pressed its face against the windows and waited. Fatima lifted her chin. She did not look at Evrenos, not yet, because looking at him now would have broken the composure she had spent her entire life building, and she would not break, not here, not in front of everyone, not when this moment deserved dignity above all else. She looked at her father and she said, "I consent, with all my heart, I consent." And the room exhaled. Jarkutai's face split into a grin so wide it seemed to threaten the structural integrity of his skull. He clapped his hands together and turned to Evrenos and grabbed him by both shoulders and shook him with an enthusiasm that would have unseated a lesser man from his feet. Evrenos, for his part, allowed himself the smallest smile, a smile that contained within it every prayer he had ever whispered, every hope he had ever harbored, every dream he had thought the world too cruel to grant. He bowed his head toward the Sultan and said, "You honor me beyond what I deserve, my Sultan. I will spend the rest of my days proving worthy of this trust." And then, and only then, he allowed himself to look at Fatima, and she looked back, and in that look was the beginning of something that neither war nor time nor the machinations of emperors and traitors would ever be able to destroy. Malhan rose and embraced her daughter, and Halima was beside them in an instant, and Gonya pressed her hand to her heart, and even a sporcher whose own heart carried wounds that had not yet healed, smiled with a warmth that was genuine and unguarded. Qasim, still seated behind Evrenos with his arms crossed, looked up at the warrior he had pledged to support and said, with the gravity of a boy playing at being a man and accidentally succeeding, "I told you I would be on your side." But even as the warmth of that moment filled the room like sunlight filling a valley after a long winter, outside the walls, the darkness had not retreated. It had merely been watching, and what it watched for was coming. Far from Bursa, in the dense forests that stretched between the territories of the faithful and the crumbling edges of the Byzantine frontier, Orhan had made his temporary camp in a clearing where the trees grew so close together that their canopy formed a roof as impenetrable as any ceiling of stone. The Byzantine soldier sat bound to a tree, his face a ruin of blood and swelling, his eyes darting between Orhan and Kantrali with the desperate calculation of a man trying to determine which of his captors might show mercy. Neither of them would. He had begun to understand this. Orhan crouched before him, close enough that the soldier could smell the leather of his armor and the iron on his breath. "You have been brave," Orhan said, and his voice carried no mockery. "Brave men deserve the truth, so I will give it to you. You will tell me what I want to know. The only question is whether you tell me now, while you still have the use of your tongue and your fingers and your eyes, or whether you tell me later, after I have taken some of those things from you and you discover that courage has a limit, and that limit is pain." The soldier spat blood onto the ground between them and said nothing. Orhan nodded, as though this was the answer he had expected, perhaps even the answer he had hoped for. He stood and turned to Kantrali. "Build a fire," he said, "and heat the iron. We have time. The night is long." And Kantrali moved to obey, gathering wood with the practiced efficiency of a man who had performed this particular task many times before, and the soldier watched the flames grow with eyes that widened in a way that told Orhan everything he needed to know about how the next hour would unfold. It did not take long, it never does. The iron turned orange in the fire, and Orhan lifted it and held it close enough to the soldier's face that the man could feel the heat against his skin like the breath of something ancient and merciless. And the soldier broke, not all at once, not with a single dramatic collapse, but in pieces, the way a dam breaks, first a crack, then a trickle, then a flood that cannot be stopped. "Samandra," the soldier gasped, and the word came out garbled through his swollen lips. "The eastern wall. There is a section near the cistern where the stones have not been repaired since the earthquake 3 winters past. The mortar is sand. A strong ram would breach it in 4 strikes. And the garrison," he continued, his words tumbling over each other now, desperate to escape his mouth before the iron came closer, "the garrison is half what it should be." The governor sent 200 men south to reinforce the coastal defenses. The watchtower on the northern ridge is manned by only 6 men, and they sleep in shifts of 2. At midnight there are only 2 awake, 2 men between your army and the interior of the fortress. Orhan lowered the iron. He did not smile. He did not thank the man. He simply looked at Kantrali and said, "Remember every word." And then he stood and walked to the edge of the clearing and looked up at the sky where the stars burned with the cold indifference of things that have watched civilizations rise and fall and rise again and feel nothing about any of it. "Samandra," he murmured to himself, "the eastern wall, 4 strikes." Behind him, the soldier slumped against his bonds and wept, not because of the pain, though the pain was considerable, but because he understood that what he had just done could not be undone. He had opened the door, and through that door would pour a tide of steel and faith and fury that would sweep away everything he had ever known, and there was no prayer in any language that could close it again. When word reached Bursa, it came in the grey hour before dawn, carried by a rider whose horse was lathered and heaving and whose own face bore the marks of a journey made at reckless speed through hostile territory. Tarhan's message was brief because Tarhan was a man who understood that brevity was the soul of military intelligence. Eastern wall, cistern section, weakened mortar, half garrison, northern watchtower, 6 men, 2 awake at midnight, strike within 3 days or the governor will reinforce. Orhan Sahib read the message in his war chamber, surrounded by the men who would translate those words into action. Aladdin stood at his right hand, Khalil stood at his left. Abdul Rahman, whose experience in siege warfare was unmatched in the Sultanate, leaned over the map table with his thick fingers tracing the approaches to Samandra. Tamir Boga, who commanded the cavalry and whose riders could cover ground faster than any force in the region, stood near the window with his arms folded. And Mustafa, youngest of the war council, but possessed of a tactical mind that compensated for his youth, studied the message with narrowed eyes. 3 days, Orhan Sahib said, and every man in the room understood that those 2 words contained within them the compressed weight of 1,000 decisions, each one of which could mean the difference between victory and catastrophe, between the expansion of the faith and a defeat that would embolden every enemy from the Danube to the Euphrates. Abdul Rahman spoke first. "The eastern wall can be reached through the forest approach if we move the siege engines along the dry riverbed. It adds half a day to the march, but it keeps us hidden from the northern watchtower until we are within striking distance." Tamir Boga countered, "Half a day is half a day we may not have. If the governor learns his man has been taken, he will reinforce within hours, not days. We should send the cavalry ahead to secure the ridge and blind the watchtower before the main force moves." Mustafa looked up from the message and said, "There is another consideration, my sultan. If Samandra falls, it opens the road to the coast. Shahanshah will not sit idle while we cut his supply lines. He will move to intercept, and he will move fast. We must plan not only for the siege but for the battle that follows, because there will be a battle, that much is certain." Orhan Sahib listened to each of them with the patience of a man who has learned that the wisdom of counsel lies not in any single voice but in the spaces between them. He let them debate, he let them argue, he let Tamir Boga's impatience clash with Abdul Rahman's caution and Mustafa's foresight temper both, and when the arguments had run their course and the room fell silent, waiting for the Sultan's word, he spoke. "We move tomorrow at sunset. Abdul Rahman will command the siege engines. You will take the dry riverbed and you will reach that wall before the 3rd dawn. Tamir Boga, your cavalry, will ride ahead. You will take the northern ridge and you will ensure that when our rams strike that wall there is no one left alive to raise the alarm. Mustafa, you will hold the reserve. When Samandra falls, and it will fall, you will fortify the breach and prepare for what comes after, because Mustafa is right. Shahanshah will come, and when he comes we will be ready." He paused and his gaze swept the room, touching each face, weighing each soul. "Khalil," he said, "you will lead the prayers tonight. Every man in this army will stand before God and ask for his guidance and his mercy and his strength, because what we do tomorrow we do not for glory and we do not for gold. We do it because the road to justice passes through Samandra, and justice does not wait for men who hesitate." The room moved, men scattered to their duties with the focused urgency of a machine that has been wound tight and released. Orders were dispatched, horses were saddled, blades were sharpened on whetstones that sang their high thin songs into the pre-dawn air. The forge fires that had been banked for the night were stoked again, and the blacksmith set to work repairing armor and reinforcing the iron heads of battering rams that would soon taste Byzantine stone. But before the preparations consumed him entirely, Orhan Sahib returned to the room where the evening's celebration still lingered like perfume in an empty hall. The cushions still bore the impressions of the bodies that had sat upon them. The cups of sherbet still stood half-finished on the tray, and the small ornate box that he had carried from Nilofer's chamber earlier that night still rested in his hand. He opened it. Inside, nestled in velvet that had faded from red to the color of old blood, lay a ring. Simple, gold, unadorned save for a single inscription in Arabic that read, "Justice is the foundation of sovereignty." It had been his father's ring, and his father's father's before that. And before that, it had belonged to a man whose name had been lost to time but whose principle had survived, passed down through generations of men who understood that power without justice was merely tyranny with a better title. He closed the box. He would give it to Evrenos on the day of the wedding, if they all survived long enough for there to be a wedding, if Samandra fell, if Shahanshah did not outmaneuver them, if Yakid's oath of vengeance did not ignite a fire that consumed allies and enemies alike, if Damir Khan's blade did not find Dursun's neck before Dursun could reach safety. If Mahmud's silence did not conceal a treachery so deep that when it finally surfaced, it would crack the alliance like a fault line cracking the earth. If. The Sultan placed the box on the table and walked to the window and looked out at the city he had built, the minarets and the rooftops and the narrow streets where his people slept, trusting him to keep them safe, trusting him to make the right decisions, trusting him to be the man his father had believed he could be. And for a moment, just a moment, the weight of that trust was almost more than he could bear. Then the call to prayer rose from the minaret of the great mosque, and the Sultan closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him like water over parched earth, and the weight shifted, redistributed itself across his shoulders the way it always did, the way it had to because there was no one else to carry it, and the dawn was coming, and the war was not over, and the men needed their commander, and the commander needed his God, and God, in his infinite and inscrutable mercy, had given him another day to prove worthy. He opened his eyes, he straightened his spine, he turned from the window and walked toward the war chamber, and his stride was the stride of a man who has made his peace with whatever is coming, not because he knows it will be good, but because he knows he will face it standing. In the forest, as the first grey light filtered through the canopy, Yakid had not moved from his mother's grave. He had spent the night there, speaking to her in whispers that the trees absorbed without judgment, telling her about the men who had wronged them, naming them one by one, describing in careful detail what he intended to do to each of them. His voice had been steady throughout, the steadiness of madness or devotion or something that existed in the space between the two, where the bravest and most dangerous men in history have always lived. He rose as the light grew, his knees were stiff from the cold ground, his eyes were dry because he had passed beyond tears hours ago into a territory where grief transforms into something harder and sharper and infinitely more useful. He folded his mother's cloth with the reverence of a priest handling a sacred relic and placed it inside his armor against his chest, where it would rest over his heart like a second skin, and then he mounted his horse and rode. He did not ride toward Bursa, he did not ride toward Ijani, he rode instead toward a place that no one expected him to go, a small village on the border between territories, where a man named Zarkan maintained a network of informants and smugglers and disaffected soldiers whose loyalty could be purchased for the right price. Yakid needed men, not many, just enough. Enough to strike where the strike would hurt most, enough to send a message that could not be ignored, enough to ensure that when the histories were written, his mother's name would be remembered, and the names of those who had wronged her would be spoken only with shame. Zarkan was waiting for him. The old spymaster sat in the back room of a tavern that smelled of stale wine and fresh conspiracy, his face hidden in the shadows, his fingers wrapped around a cup he had not drunk from. When Yakid entered, Zarkan did not rise. He simply watched, the way a man watches a fire, gauging its heat, its direction, its potential for destruction. "You look like a man who has made a decision," Zarkan said. "I have," Yakid replied, and he sat down and began to speak, and what he described was not a plan born of strategy or calculation, but a plan born of grief, and grief, as Zarkan knew better than most, was the most dangerous fuel in the world, because it burned without limit and consumed without discrimination and could not be extinguished by any force known to man. Zarkan listened, he asked questions, he raised objections, and one by one Yakid answered them, dismantled them, swept them aside with the quiet certainty of a man who has nothing left to lose and therefore nothing left to fear. And when the conversation ended and Yakid rose to leave, Zarkan remained in his chair and stared at the cup he had not drunk from and understood, with the clarity that comes only to those who have survived long enough to see patterns repeat themselves across generations, that the young man who had just walked out of his tavern was either going to change the course of the war or die trying, and that either outcome would leave scars on the world that would take decades to heal. Back at the fortress of Ijani, Damir Khan had not slept. He stood on the battlements as the dawn broke, his hands gripping the stone parapet with a force that turned his knuckles white, and he stared out at the landscape as though he could see Dursun hiding somewhere in the folds of the earth. Beside him, Shahanshah approached with the measured tread of a man who has learned to move quietly in spaces where loud footsteps might attract the wrong kind of attention. "You are still thinking about him," Shahanshah said. "I'm thinking about what he will do," Damir Khan replied. "Not who he is, I know who he is blood of my blood, but blood means nothing when the vessel that carries it has been poisoned. He will go to Orhan. He will tell Orhan everything he knows about our defenses, our troop movements, our supply lines, our alliances with the Pope's envoy, everything. and Orhan will use that knowledge the way a blacksmith uses a hammer to reshape the world into something that serves his purpose. Shahanshah was quiet for a moment, then he said, let him go to Orhan, let him tell Orhan everything, because by the time Orhan acts on that information, the information will be old, we will have moved, we will have changed our positions, our plans, our alliances. The advantage of being the deceived is that the deceiver believes his deception has worked, and that belief makes him careless. And carelessness, Damir Khan, is a wound more fatal than any blade. Damir Khan turned to look at Shahanshah, and for the first time in their long and complicated alliance, he saw something in the emperor's eyes that he had not seen before. It was not cunning, though cunning was there. It was not ambition, though ambition was there. It was something older and deeper and more dangerous than either. It was patience. The patience of a man who has been knocked from his throne and has decided, with the cold rationality of a mathematician, that the surest way back to power is not speed but timing, not strength but precision, not a single overwhelming blow but a series of small, carefully placed incisions, each one insignificant on its own, each one devastating in combination. What are you planning? Damir Khan asked. Shahanshah smiled, and the smile was thin and sharp and utterly devoid of warmth. I am planning, he said, to give Orhan exactly what he wants, and then I am planning to take it away from him in the moment when he believes he has won, because there is no defeat more total than the defeat that follows victory. A man who loses a battle knows he has lost. A man who wins a battle and then watches his victory turn to ashes in his hands, that man is destroyed, not just his army, not just his kingdom, his spirit, his soul, the very thing inside him that makes him believe he can fight again. Damir Khan stared at him, and for the first time in a very long time he felt something he had not expected to feel. He felt afraid, not of Shahanshah, of what Shahanshah was becoming. The preparations continued through the day. In Bursa, swords were sharpened and prayers were whispered, and men who knew they might not see another sunrise embraced their wives and held their children, and did not speak of what was coming, because speaking of it would make it real, and reality at this moment was something best kept at arm's length. In the forest, Turhan bound the Byzantine soldier's wounds with rough cloth and gave him water, not out of kindness but out of pragmatism, because a dead informant is useless, and Turhan was nothing if not pragmatic. He sent Kantrali ahead to scout the dry riverbed approach that Abdul Rahman would use for the siege engines, and Kantrali disappeared into the trees with the ease of a man who had been born in the forest and had never entirely left it. In the palace, the household moved through the day in a state of suspended animation. The betrothal of Fatima and Evrenos had filled the morning with a brightness that the afternoon's war preparations could not entirely extinguish. Halima braided Fatima's hair and told her stories of their mother, stories that Fatima had heard 100 times but never tired of hearing, because each telling added a detail, a color, a texture that had not been there before, and the stories grew richer with each repetition, the way soil grows richer with each season's turning. Evrenos, meanwhile, sat with a lordin in the outer courtyard, and the two men spoke of things that soldiers speak of when the women are not present, not because the things themselves are secret, but because the tone in which they are spoken is different when only men are listening. Alauddin said, you understand what you are taking on, not just a wife, not just a daughter of this house. You are taking on the weight of this family's honor, and this family's enemies, and this family's expectations, which are higher than any wall you will ever be asked to breach. Evrenos said, I understand. And then, after a pause that lasted longer than words, he said, I have spent my life proving myself on the battlefield. I have earned the right to stand among the finest commanders of this age. But this morning, when she said those words, when she said she consented, I understood for the first time that everything I have done until now was preparation, not for war, for this, for being worthy of someone who deserves more than I may ever be able to give. Alauddin studied him for a long time, and then he reached out and gripped Evrenos by the back of the neck, pulling him close, forehead to forehead, the way brothers do, the way fathers do, the way men do when words are insufficient and physical contact is the only language that remains. Then be worthy, Alauddin said, every day, every hour, every breath, be worthy. And Evrenos closed his eyes and said, Inshallah. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and blood, and the deep purple of bruises that have not yet healed, the army assembled. They gathered in the great yard outside the walls of Bursa, rank upon rank of men who had left their homes and their families and their fields and their trades to stand in formation and wait for the command that would send them marching towards something that many of them would not survive. They did not complain. They did not waver. They stood and they waited, and when Khalil climbed the steps of the raised platform at the center of the yard and lifted his hands to lead the evening prayer, every man among them turned toward Mecca and knelt. The prayer rose into the evening air like smoke from a sacred fire, and the words were the words that had been spoken by believers for centuries, words that connected the men kneeling in that yard to every generation of faithful who had come before them and every generation that would come after, words that transcended time and place and circumstance and spoke directly to the heart of the divine. And when the prayer ended, and the men rose and the last echoes faded into the deepening dusk, Orhan Sahib mounted his horse and rode to the front of the formation and looked out at the faces of his army. He did not give a speech. Orhan Sahib was not a man who gave speeches. He was a man who gave orders and kept promises and led from the front and expected his men to follow not because he commanded them to, but because they had seen him bleed alongside them and knew that he would never ask them to endure anything he was not willing to endure himself. He simply looked at them and they looked at him, and the understanding that passed between them required no words. Then he raised his hand, and the column began to move. They marched through the night. The road wound through terrain that alternated between open meadow and dense forest, and the column stretched for nearly a mile, the infantry at the center, the cavalry on the flanks, the siege engines creaking and groaning at the rear like ancient beasts dragged reluctantly from their dens. The moon emerged and retreated behind clouds in an irregular rhythm that provided just enough light to march by, and not enough to be seen by anyone who might be watching from the hills. Orhan met them at the crossing of the dry riverbed, stepping out of the darkness like a ghost. He spoke briefly with Abdul Rahman, pointing out the path he had scouted, indicating the places where the riverbed narrowed and the siege engines would need to be dismantled and reassembled, the places where the banks were soft and might give way under the weight of the rams. Abdul Rahman listened, asked 3 questions, received 3 answers and nodded. "It will be done," he said. And he turned to his engineers and began issuing orders that sent them swarming over the siege engines like ants over fallen fruit. Tamir Boga's cavalry peeled away from the main column and vanished into the northern forest, 200 riders moving with a discipline and silence that would have been impressive in daylight and was nothing short of miraculous in darkness. They would reach the northern ridge by midnight. They would neutralize the watchtower. They would ensure that when the rams began their work on the eastern wall, the only sound the defenders would hear would be the sound of their own destruction. Mustafa positioned his reserve on a low hill overlooking the approach to Samandra, a position that gave him visibility in all directions and the ability to respond to threats from any quarter. He set his pickets and his signal fires and his emergency withdrawal routes with the methodical precision of a man who plans for every contingency, because he has seen too many battles lost by men who planned for only the most likely one. And Orhan Sahib rode at the head of the column, his eyes fixed on the eastern horizon where Samandra waited, unaware of what was coming, unaware that its walls had been betrayed and its garrison had been counted, and its weaknesses had been catalogued by a man whose tongue had been loosened by the heat of an iron bar in a forest clearing. The Sultan rode, and behind him rode the future, and the future was armored and armed, and it carried in its heart the accumulated fury and faith and determination of a people who had been told they could not build an empire and had built one anyway. The war was not over, the war was arriving, and when it arrived, it would arrive with the force of a river that has been dammed too long, a river that has gathered behind its barrier until the barrier can no longer hold, a river that when it breaks free will reshape the landscape in ways that no man can predict and no man can control, and no man, not even a sultan, not even an emperor, not even a man kneeling beside his mother's grave with an oath of blood on his lips, can stop. The night deepened, the column marched, the stars turned overhead with their ancient indifference, and somewhere ahead in the darkness, the walls of Samandra stood silent and waiting, unaware that their silence was about to be shattered in ways that would echo through the corridors of history for generations to come. Remember this march, remember these men, remember the sound of their boots on the dry earth and the creak of their armor and the whispered prayers that rose from their ranks like mist rising from a river at dawn. Remember the determination in their eyes and the fear they swallowed and the faith they carried and the love they left behind in warm beds and candlelit rooms where women held children and waited and hoped and prayed to a God who had promised that justice would prevail but had never promised that justice would be painless. The war is not over, the walls have not fallen, the blood has not been spilled, but the blade has been drawn and the hand that holds it does not tremble, and the dawn that is coming will bring with it a reckoning that no fortress, no emperor, no alliance of crowns and crosses can withstand. Until that dawn breaks, hold your breath, hold your hearts, hold your prayers close, because what comes next will test every soul that stands in its path, and not every soul will survive the testing. The war is not over, it is closer now than it has ever been, and when it arrives, history itself will flinch. As the blackest night of the realm descended upon the narrow defiles of Demir Pass like the closing fist of destiny itself, Orhan Sahib raised his sword high amid the choking smoke and roaring flames, his voice thundering across the blood-soaked valley like the call of the final trumpet. To me, all who stand for faith and honor, to me, we do not yield, we do not break. Allah is with the patient, and justice rides upon our blades this night. The ground itself trembled beneath the weight of fresh thousands pouring into the pass, their armor gleaming dully through the inferno as the Pope's grand host revealed its true merciless scale. Fire arrows continued to arc overhead like falling stars of wrath, igniting siege wagons and dry brush alike, while thick black smoke rolled through the narrow corridors of stone, turning warriors into ghosts and every clash of steel into a dance with death. Orhan fought like a man possessed by divine fury at the eastern flank, his elite riders slamming repeatedly into the enemy's exposed side. "Cut them off," he roared, his sword flashing as he cleaved through a line of Frankish crossbowmen. "Burn their supplies until their god himself feels the hunger." Wagons exploded in brilliant bursts of flame and debris, sending sparks raining down upon the struggling masses and sowing panic through the papal ranks. Horses screamed and bolted, trampling their own riders as the psychological weight of endless raids finally cracked the invaders' spirit. Many began to waver, throwing down weapons and crying for mercy, only to be cut down by their own fanatical commanders who screamed blessings and threats in equal measure. Dursun held the high ridges with unyielding resolve, his Karasi warriors sending volley after volley of arrows into the smoke-choked valley below. "For the faith, for the house that stands unbroken," he shouted, his voice raw with the accumulated pain of his brother's betrayal and every battle since. Arrows whistled through the darkness like the breath of vengeance, finding marks in the throats and eyes of armored knights who had believed their heavy plate would make them invincible. The narrowness of the pass became their tomb. Horses could not maneuver, heavy armor became weights that dragged men down into the mud, and the flames that Orhan's strategy had invited turned the entire defile into a corridor of fire and judgment. In the heart of this apocalyptic chaos, Orhan Faladios carved a path of righteous destruction toward the center, his blade singing a song of vengeance for every fallen brother, every betrayed oath. "Your cross has brought only death to these sacred lands," he bellowed as he met another papal champion in brutal single combat. The two warriors clashed atop a burning wagon, their horses long since fallen. Steel rang with bone-shaking force, sparks exploding into the smoke as Faladios fought with the accumulated wrath of every trial the realm had endured. The papal knight, a massive figure blessed by the Pope himself, swung with fanatical power. "Heathen, we will purify this soil with your blood." Their duel raged as flames licked higher, the wagon beginning to collapse beneath them. Faladios feinted left, twisted with lethal grace, and drove his sword through a gap in the armor, ending the man's life as the structure gave way and sent both crashing into the inferno below. He rose from the flames like a demon of justice, bloodied but unbroken, rallying the center once more. Orhan himself fought at the very eye of the storm, his sword a blur of divine will as he met wave after wave of the enemy's elite guard. "Stand with me, my brothers," he cried, voice rising above the roar of battle. "This is not merely war, this is the defense of everything we hold sacred, for every prayer called from our minarets, for every child who deserves to grow under the protection of faith." His blade claimed life after life, each strike fueled by the memory of Damir Khan's fall, Nilofar's poison, and the endless betrayals that had tested the realm to its core. Around him, warriors fought with renewed strength, inspired by the sight of their commander standing unbowed amid the fire and smoke. Yet the greatest threat came not from the front, but from the shadows within. A group of infiltrators, traitors who had slipped through the lines wearing stolen Osman colors, struck suddenly near a Sporcher's position. She fought like a lioness cornered, her sword flashing with desperate skill as she defended herself against three assailants. "You will not take me again," she screamed, her voice cutting through the chaos. One traitor fell to her blade, but another grabbed her arm, dragging her toward the smoke where hidden horses waited. "Nilofar's will lives on. You will be leverage for the Pope's victory." Orhan saw the danger first. With a roar that shook the heavens, he broke from his riders and charged through the flames, his sword intercepting the traitors in a whirlwind of steel. "Release her, you dogs of betrayal." He cut down two in rapid succession, his body a shield as arrows whistled past. A Sporcher broke free, standing back to back with him as the last assailant lunged. Their blades met his together, ending the threat in a spray of blood that mixed with the rising smoke. "Thank you, Orhan," she gasped, breathing heavily, "not just for me, for all of us." But even as that threat was ended, the greater storm revealed its final face. From the western mouth of the pass, the Pope's true elite force emerged, fresh troops who had landed that very night, their armor untouched by previous battles, their priests chanting loudly as they marched under a massive black cross that seemed to drink in the firelight. At their head rode the Pope's own legate, a figure of cold authority whose voice carried across the battlefield like a curse. "In the name of the Holy Father, this land will be cleansed. The house of Osman ends tonight." Orhan turned to face this new wave, his captains rallying around him, Orhan bloodied but fierce, Dursun with arrows still flying from the ridges, Orhan Faladios returning from his duel like an avenging spirit, and a Sporcher standing tall beside her husband, sword raised. The final, cataclysmic clash began. The two forces collided with the force of colliding mountains. Steel met steel in a deafening roar that drowned out even the thunder above. Flames consumed entire sections of the pass as siege equipment burned uncontrollably. Smoke became so thick that men fought by sound and instinct alone, calling out the names of their brothers to avoid killing their own in the blindness. In this ultimate crucible, Orhan met the papal legate in single combat upon a ridge overlooking the madness below. Their horses met with thunderous impact. Blades crashed together with such force that sparks lit the smoke around them like stars being born in hell. "Your reign of heresy ends here," the legate proclaimed, his voice filled with holy rage. Orhan answered with calm, unyielding power. "You bring war in the name of God, yet know nothing of true faith. This land belongs to those who walk the straight path. Your cross has already failed." Their duel was fierce and masterful, each man a titan of his cause. The legate fought with the accumulated zeal of a lifetime of crusades. Orhan fought with the love of his family, the honor of his house, and the prayers of an entire people. Steel sang, horses reared. The ridge itself seemed to tremble as fire spread below them and arrows continued to rain from Dursun's position. With a final, powerful series of strikes born from every trial he had endured, Orhan disarmed the legate and brought him to his knees upon the bloodied stone. "Mercy," the man gasped, looking up with fear in his eyes for the first time. Orhan stood over him, chest heaving. "Mercy is granted to those who seek redemption. You sought only destruction, your fate is written." As the grand host finally broke and began a chaotic retreat into the night, victory seemed at hand. Cheers began to rise from the Osman ranks. But then from the direction of Bursa, a lone, bloodied rider emerged through the smoke at full gallop, collapsing at Orhan's feet. "Orhan Sahib, the final betrayal, the traitors inside the citadel have opened the main gates. The Pope's personal guard is already inside the city. They hold the central mosque, and they have taken Qasim and Suleiman hostage, demanding your surrender and the execution of a sporcher as a witch who brought division." Orhan's face transformed into a mask of thunderous fury and profound pain as fresh fires bloomed on the horizon where Bursa lay. A sporcher's hand found his, squeezing tightly. Turhan, Dursun, and Burhan Faladios turned to him, waiting for the command that would decide everything. The night had never been darker. Smoke choked the pass, the wounded cried out, and in the distance the lights of a city under siege burned like a funeral pyre for the realm itself. Orhan raised his sword once more, his voice rising like a prayer and a roar combined. "Then we ride for home, no rest, no mercy. We end this tonight or we die trying, for the faith, for our children, for everything we have bled to protect." The surviving warriors turned as one, exhausted beyond measure, yet driven by a fire no enemy could extinguish. As the final, apocalyptic march toward Bursa began beneath a sky that seemed to weep blood and fire, the epic struggle for the soul of the realm hurtling toward its ultimate, merciless conclusion. As the blood moon bled its final light across the devastated pass of Demia, Orhan Sahib spurred his warhorse forward with a fury that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth, his voice rising like thunder rolling through the mountains. "Ride, ride for Bursa, ride for our children, ride for everything we have bled, suffered, and prayed for. No rest, no mercy for the traitors who have opened our sacred gates to the enemy." The surviving Osman host, bloodied, exhausted beyond mortal limits, yet bound together by unbreakable faith and iron will, turned as one and began the desperate night march westward. Hooves thundered across the scorched plain, carrying warriors who had not slept in days, whose wounds wept openly beneath torn armor, yet whose eyes burned with a fire no darkness could extinguish. Behind them, the shattered remnants of the Pope's grand host lay in ruins, their crosses broken, their siege engines reduced to smoldering skeletons, their priests silent at last. But ahead, the true heart of the realm bled. Smoke from 1,000 fires stained the night sky as the column pushed forward without pause. Turhan rode at the vanguard, his elite riders forming a spear of vengeance cutting through the darkness. "We will reach the gates before they can consolidate," he shouted back, his voice hoarse but unyielding. "Every traitor who opened our walls will taste my steel." Dursun galloped beside him, the bruises around his throat from the forest long ago now joined by fresh wounds, yet his resolve had never been stronger. "I lost one brother to betrayal. I will not lose the future of this house. The Karasi ride with death itself tonight." Burhan Faladios brought up the rear with the main strength, his sword never leaving his hand, his eyes scanning every shadow for ambush. A sporcher rode in the command group beside Orhan, her face streaked with soot and dried blood, yet her posture remained that of a queen forged in fire. "Our sons are in danger," she said, voice steady despite the terror gripping her heart. "We will tear down every wall and every traitor between us and them." The ride became a fevered nightmare. Horses stumbled from exhaustion but were driven forward by the sheer will of their riders. Messengers met them on the road with ever graver tidings. The traitorous captains had seized the central citadel and the great mosque, holding Qasim and Suleiman as hostages upon the highest minaret. The Pope's personal guard, elite knights in black armor bearing golden crosses, now occupied key positions within the city walls, their torches visible from miles away like the eyes of demons. Fires burned in the outer districts where loyal citizens fought desperate skirmishes against the invaders. The realm's heart had been pierced, and it bled profusely. As the first grey light of false dawn touched the horizon, the walls of Bursa rose before them like the bones of a wounded giant. Flames licked at several towers. The great gate stood partially open, guarded by traitors who flew both the crescent and the cross in blasphemous union. Orhan reined in his horse before the city, his voice carrying across the host like the judgment of the ages. This is not merely our city. This is the beating heart of our faith in these lands. We do not storm it as conquerors. We reclaim it as fathers, as brothers, as guardians of everything holy. Tarhan, take your riders and secure the outer walls. Prevent any escape. Dursun, lead your Karasi through the eastern passages. Clear the traitors from the rooftops. Barhin Faladios, you will fight beside me into the central citadel. Asporcha, stay close. Your courage will be needed when we reach our sons. The assault upon Bursa began with holy fury. Tarhan's riders crashed through the partially open gates like a storm of righteous wrath, steel flashing as they cut down the surprised traitors who had expected Orhan to still be days away. Arrows rained from the walls as loyal archers who had held hidden positions revealed themselves, joining the fight. Flames spread through the outer quarters where desperate street fighting erupted between citizens and invaders. Smoke billowed through narrow alleys, turning the familiar streets of home into a labyrinth of fire and shadow. Orhan led the central thrust toward the great mosque and citadel, Orhan Faladios at his right like an angel of death. They fought through the grand square where fountains once sang peacefully, now running red. For the house of Osman, Orhan roared as he carved a path through a line of papal knights, his blade claiming 3 lives in as many heartbeats. The clash was brutal and intimate, fought in the very streets where children had once played. Steel rang against stone, men died calling upon their gods. Fires consumed merchant stalls and sacred arches alike, as chaos consumed the city. In the heart of the great mosque's inner courtyard, Orhan finally came face to face with the leader of the traitors, Captain Zahir, the same man he had disarmed at Aksu, now risen again through sheer hatred. You should have died on the field, Zahir screamed as their blades met once more amid the smoke drifting through the sacred space. Your weakness brought this upon us, a scorcher divided the house, Nilafar spoke truth. Their duel became the soul of the battle, steel crashing with apocalyptic force beneath the high dome where prayers had once risen pure. Zahir fought with the madness of a man who had sold everything. Orhan fought with the love of a father whose children were held above in chains. You opened our gates to the enemy, Orhan thundered, parrying a vicious overhead strike. You threatened my sons, your betrayal ends here. Sparks exploded as their blades locked. The 2 men twisted and lunged, their horses long abandoned, fighting on foot amid fallen banners and dying men. With a final, powerful series of strikes born from every pain the realm had suffered, Orhan disarmed Zahir and drove him to his knees. But before the killing blow could fall, a scream echoed from above. The traitors had dragged Qasim and Suleiman onto the highest balcony of the minaret, blades held to their throats. Surrender, Orhan Saheb, one shouted. Release Nilafar and bow to the cross, or watch your bloodline die before your eyes. Asporcha's cry of anguish cut through the chaos. Tarhan and Dursun fought their way toward the base of the minaret, but papal knights blocked their path. Orhan Faladios roared in fury as he tried to break through. Orhan stood frozen for one terrible heartbeat, looking up at his sons' terrified yet brave faces. At that exact moment, a new thunder rolled from the western gates. The Pope's personal legion had fully entered the city, their black cross banners raised high as they marched toward the central mosque to deliver the final blow. Smoke choked the sacred space, flames climbed the walls of the mosque, the cries of the dying mixed with desperate prayers, and high above, the blades pressed closer to the throats of the young princes as the ultimate test of faith, honor, and a father's love reached its shattering climax. Orhan raised his sword toward the balcony, his voice breaking through the roar of battle like a final oath sworn before the heavens themselves. Hold, my sons, your father comes, the realm will not fall this night. The final, merciless storm had arrived at the very heart of Bursa, and in its raging core, the destiny of empires, families, and an entire faith hung suspended by the thinnest, most fragile thread of steel, prayer, and unyielding will. The night had become eternal, and the war refused to end until every last betrayal was answered, and every prayer tested in the fires of judgment. As the final veil of night clung desperately to the spires of Bursa like a shroud unwilling to release the dying, Orhan Saheb charged forward through the smoke-filled courtyard of the great mosque, his boots pounding across sacred stone now slick with blood and littered with fallen banners. Flames climbed the ancient walls like hungry demons, casting flickering hellish light across the high dome where prayers had once ascended pure and unbroken. The air was thick enough to choke the soul itself, smoke from burning tapestries, the metallic reek of fresh blood, and the desperate cries of men calling upon Allah and the cross in the same gasping breaths. High above on the narrow balcony of the minaret, young Qasim and Suleiman stood with blades pressed against their small throats, their faces pale yet defiant, eyes searching desperately for their father in the chaos below. Hold my sons, Orhan roared, his voice cutting through the roar of battle like a blade through silk. Your father comes, do not fear, faith will shield you. The traitor holding Qasim laughed bitterly, pressing the edge deeper. Surrender, Orhan Sahib, release Nilafar and bow before the Holy Father's legions, or watch your bloodline spill upon these stones. Esportia fought beside him like a storm unleashed, her sword flashing as she cut down 2 papal guards who tried to block their path. You will not touch them, she screamed, her voice raw with a mother's fury. Turhan and Burhan Faladios carved a bloody path on the left flank, their blades singing a song of vengeance as they cleared the steps leading upward. Dursun led a group of Karasi warriors up the outer staircase, arrows nocked even in the tight confines, ready to loose at any who dared harm the princes. The climb to the minaret became a vertical battlefield of pure savagery. Orhan fought step by step, his sword a whirlwind of righteous wrath. A papal knight in black armor lunged at him from a landing, their blades met with thunderous force. Your house ends tonight, the knight snarled. Orhan twisted, parried, and drove his sword through the man's chest with a single powerful thrust. This house was built by faith, not fear, he growled, kicking the dying man aside. Smoke poured up the narrow stairwell, blinding and choking, while flames from below licked at the wooden supports, threatening to bring the entire structure crashing down. Higher up, the lead traitor, Captain Zahir, his face twisted with madness and defeat, shoved young Qasim closer to the edge. See, Orhan, this is what your weakness has wrought. A sporture divided us. The cross offers order. Surrender now. Suleiman, though small, spat defiance. Our father will never bow. Allah is with us. The boy's courage brought tears to Orhan's eyes even as he fought onward. Burhan Faladios reached the balcony first, slamming into Zahir's remaining guards like a battering ram. His sword moved with lethal precision, ending 2 lives in the space of heartbeats. You dare threaten the sons of Osman, he bellowed. Turhan arrived moments later, intercepting an arrow meant for Dursun and driving his blade into another traitor's side. The Karasi are here, the city rises with us. Orhan finally burst onto the balcony, his chest heaving, blood streaming from a cut across his forehead. Zahir held both boys, now one in each arm, blades at their necks. The 2 men locked eyes across the narrow space, the minaret swaying slightly as flames consumed the lower levels. It did not have to come to this, Zahir, Orhan said, voice low and heavy with sorrow. You were once my brother in arms, now you stand with the cross against your own people. Zahir's laugh was broken. You brought an outsider into the heart of power. Nilafar warned us. The realm fractures because of her, because of you. The final duel upon the burning minaret was fierce and deeply personal. Zahir released the boys into the hands of his last guard and charged. Their blades met with apocalyptic force, steel screaming against steel as the structure groaned beneath them. Sparks flew into the smoke-filled night. Orhan fought with the love of a father, the duty of a ruler, and the faith of a man who had walked through every trial fate could devise. Zahir fought with the desperation of a soul that had sold everything and now sought only destruction. They circled on the narrow balcony, the drop below filled with fire and chaos. Blades flashed, bodies twisted. A powerful strike from Zahir grazed Orhan's side, drawing fresh blood. Orhan answered with a thunderous counter that shattered Zahir's guard and sent the traitor staggering back against the railing. With one final, mercifully swift strike, Orhan disarmed him completely. Zahir fell to his knees, gasping. Finish it then, end me. Orhan stood over him, sword raised. Justice is not mine alone, but you will face it. He kicked Zahir's blade away and turned to his sons, pulling Qasim and Suleiman into his arms with fierce protectiveness. The boys clung to him, sobbing. A sporcher reached them moments later, embracing all 3 as tears cut clean paths through the soot on her face. My sons, my brave sons. But the victory was cruelly short. From below, a great roar rose as the Pope's personal legion poured into the central square, their black banners raised high. Siege towers rolled forward through the burning streets and fresh waves of knights stormed the mosque compound. The city was not yet saved. The traitors inside the citadel still held parts of the palace, and distant horns signaled even more enemy reinforcements arriving from the western gates. Orhan lifted his sons onto his shoulders, his voice rising above the renewed chaos. We have reclaimed our blood, but not yet our home. Turhan, secure the outer mosque. Dursun, clear the minaret stairs. Burhan, with me to the citadel. Esportia, take the boys to safety with Malhan Khartoum. As they descended the burning minaret, the structure began to sway dangerously. Flames roared higher. The Pope's legate could be seen in the square below, raising a golden cross and calling for the final assault. In the name of the Holy See, take the city. Leave no survivor of the false house. The night had become a living hell. Smoke swallowed entire districts. Loyal citizens fought alongside Orhan's warriors in the streets. The great mosque itself groaned as its supports burned, and in the distance the central citadel still flew the blasphemous banner of cross and crescent combined. Orhan emerged from the minaret with his family protected, only to find a new wave of elite papal knights charging directly toward them. Turhan and Burhan formed a shield wall, Dursun losing his final arrows. Esportia stood with sword drawn, ready to fight to the death beside her husband. In that moment, as fresh flames erupted across the palace walls and the legate's voice called for total annihilation, a lone rider broke through the outer lines bearing one final, shattering message. Orhan Sahib, the Pope has brought the ultimate weapon, Greek fire ships on the river, and they prepare to burn the entire city if you do not surrender by dawn. Orhan looked up at the burning sky, his sons in his arms, his wife and captains surrounding him, as the greatest storm the realm had ever known reached its terrifying crescendo. The final hours had come. Victory or annihilation waited in the balance, and the fate of everything they had fought for hung by the thinnest thread of faith, steel, and a father's unyielding love. The drums of the final stand beat louder than ever, echoing through the flames and smoke as dawn approached like the blade of destiny itself. The war for the soul of the realm had reached its absolute end, and no soul within Bursa would leave this night unchanged. As the first pale fingers of dawn clawed at the smoke-choked sky over Bursa, painting the minarets in hues of blood and fire, Orhan Sahib descended the burning staircase of the great mosque with his sons clutched tightly against his chest, their small hearts pounding like war drums against his armored frame. The structure groaned and shuddered around them, ancient timbers cracking as flames devoured the lower levels with merciless hunger. Smoke poured upward in thick, choking waves, turning the sacred ascent into a corridor of hell itself. A Sporcher fought at his side, her sword red with the blood of traitors, her eyes fierce with a mother's unyielding protection. "Stay close to me, my loves," she whispered to the boys between gasping breaths. "Your father will not let the darkness take us." Behind them, Turhan and Burhan Faladios formed a rearguard of living steel, their blades flashing as they cut down the last papal knights who tried to pursue. Dursun loosed arrow after arrow from the narrow windows, each shaft finding its mark in the chaos below. "The minaret will not hold much longer," Dursun shouted. "We must reach the citadel before the flames consume everything." They burst into the grand courtyard just as the structure above began to collapse in a deafening roar of stone and fire. Sparks rained down like judgment from the heavens. The Pope's legate stood in the center of the square, his golden cross raised high, surrounded by hundreds of fresh black-armored knights who had poured through the opened gates. His voice carried across the inferno like a curse wrapped in prayer. "In the name of the Holy Father, this city of heresy will burn. Surrender the false ruler and his witch wife, or every soul within these walls will feed the flames." Orhan set his sons down behind a protective wall of loyal warriors and stepped forward, sword raised, his presence alone steadying the desperate defense. "You bring fire and betrayal to these sacred streets," he called out, voice deep and resonant, carrying the weight of every oath sworn and every trial endured. "You ally with traitors who opened our own gates, but this house was built upon faith, not fear. Leave these lands, or Allah's justice will consume you, as it has consumed all who came before." The legate's laughter was cold and hollow. "Your Allah cannot save you now. Greek fire burns upon the river. By dawn this city will be ash unless you kneel." At his signal, the elite papal guard charged. The final battle for the heart of Bursa erupted with apocalyptic fury. Steel met steel in the grand square with a sound like the breaking of the world. Flames from the collapsing minaret spread rapidly to nearby buildings, turning the night into a blazing day of judgment. Smoke rolled so thick that men fought by sound and instinct, calling out the names of brothers to avoid killing their own. Turhan led a devastating countercharge on the left, his riders smashing into the enemy flank like divine thunder. "For Orhan Sahib, for the faith that never bends." He roared, his sword claiming life after life. Burhan Faladios became a whirlwind of death in the center, his blade singing through armor and bone as he met the legate's personal champions. "Your cross has brought only ruin," he bellowed, disarming one knight and sending him crashing into the flames. Dursun climbed to a half-burned balcony and poured arrows into the advancing ranks, each shot precise and merciless. "This is for my brother's soul," he cried. "This is for every betrayal we have endured." A Sporcher fought beside Orhan with ferocious grace, her sword moving in deadly arcs as she protected their sons with her life. "You will not take them," she shouted at a group of knights who tried to break through. "Not while I draw breath." Orhan carved a path straight toward the legate, every strike fueled by the love of his family and the honor of his realm. A massive papal knight blocked his way. Their blades crashed together with earth-shaking force. "Your time is finished," Orhan growled, twisting free and driving his sword through the man's guard. Another attacker came from the side. Orhan spun, parried, and ended him with a powerful overhead strike. Smoke blinded him, flames licked at his cloak, yet he pressed forward, unyielding. Finally, he stood before the legate himself. The two leaders faced each other amid the burning square, the fate of the city hanging between them. "Kneel, barbarian," the legate hissed, raising his ornate sword. "Submit to the true faith and spare your people." Orhan's eyes burned with holy fire. "The only submission I know is to Allah. Your cross has no power here." Their duel became the soul of the storm. Blades met with apocalyptic power, sparks exploded into the smoke. The legate fought with cold, calculated zeal honed by years of holy war. Orhan fought with the accumulated pain, love, and faith of a man who had carried an entire realm upon his shoulders. Steel sang, bodies twisted. The ground trembled as nearby buildings collapsed in showers of flame and debris. With a final thunderous series of strikes, Orhan disarmed the legate and brought him to his knees. The man looked up, fear breaking through his fanaticism for the first time. "Mercy," he whispered. Orhan stood over him, chest heaving. "Mercy was offered many times, you chose fire instead." He raised his sword for the final blow. But before it fell, a great cry rose from the western gates. The Greek fire ships had reached the riverbank. Massive jets of liquid flame arched through the night, setting entire districts ablaze in seconds. The city itself began to burn in earnest. Traitors still holding parts of the citadel cheered, believing their victory at hand. Loyal citizens screamed as flames consumed their homes. The final hour had truly arrived. Orhan turned, gathering his family and captains close. "We fight to the last stone if we must. Turhan, secure the river approach. Dursun, take the boys to the inner keep with Malhan Khartun. Burhan, with me to the citadel walls. Esportia, stay with me. We end this together." As the Greek fire roared across the river and the Pope's legions pressed harder into the burning city, Orhan raised his sword one last time toward the flaming heavens. "Allah, grant us strength for this final stand. Let justice prevail though the world itself burns." The night had become eternal fire. The realm stood on the edge of annihilation. And in the heart of the inferno, Orhan Saheb, his family, and his most loyal warriors prepared for the last, bloodiest chapter of a war that had tested every oath, every prayer, and every bond of honor forged in the crucible of fate. The drums of the final defense beat louder than the roar of flames, as dawn approached like the sword of destiny itself, ready to decide once and for all whether the House of Osman would rise from the ashes or be consumed forever in the fires of betrayal and holy war. As the false dawn bled across the smoke-choked heavens like the final judgment of the ages, Bursa burned with a fury that seemed to consume both earth and sky. Greek fire roared across the river in great arcs of liquid hell, setting entire quarters ablaze in seconds, turning ancient streets into rivers of flame that devoured homes, mosques, and the cries of the innocent alike. Orhan Sahib charged through this apocalypse with his sword raised high, his voice a thunderous roar that cut through the roar of collapsing buildings and the screams of dying men. "Hold the line, sons of the faith, for every prayer that has risen from these minarets, for our children, for the soul of this realm that will not die this night." The central square had become a slaughterhouse of fire and steel. Papal knights in blackened armor pressed forward under the legate's golden cross, their fanatical chants clashing against the defiant cries of Allahu Akbar from Orhan's warriors. Flames leaped from rooftop to rooftop, consuming the wooden galleries and sacred arches, while thick black smoke rolled through the narrow alleys like the breath of Shaitan himself. Loyal citizens fought beside professional soldiers, armed with whatever they could find, kitchen knives, broken spears, stones from the streets, defending their homes with the desperation of those who knew no other life. Turhan led a suicidal charge toward the riverbank, his remaining elite riders galloping through walls of flame. "Burn their ships," he bellowed, voice raw. "Deny them the Greek fire." Arrows whistled past him as papal crossbowmen fired from the banks. One of his riders fell screaming as liquid fire engulfed horse and man in a single horrifying instant. Yet Turhan pressed on, reaching the first vessel and hurling torches onto its deck. Explosions of Greek fire lit the night in blinding white-orange fury as the ship erupted, sending flaming debris raining across the water and setting 2 more vessels ablaze. "For Orhan Saheb," he roared as his men fought like demons on the burning decks. In the heart of the great mosque compound, Orhan Faladios became a living storm of vengeance. His blade moved with terrifying speed, cutting down wave after wave of the Pope's personal guard. "You dare bring this fire to our holy city," he thundered, disarming one knight and driving his sword through the next. "Your cross will be your funeral shroud." The legate himself watched from a distance, face twisted in rage, as his elite forces crumbled against the unyielding will of men who fought for home and faith. Orhan pushed toward the citadel with Esportia at his side, their swords moving in deadly harmony. "Our sons are in there," she said between strikes, her voice steady despite the tears cutting paths through the soot on her face. "We will tear down every stone if we must." A group of traitorous captains blocked their path, their eyes filled with the madness of cornered men. "You brought this upon us," one screamed, charging. Orhan met him with a powerful overhead strike that shattered his defense. "No," he replied coldly as the man fell, "you opened the gates to it." Esportia fought beside him with ferocious grace, her blade claiming the life of another who had once sworn loyalty to the house. "Your ambition ends tonight," she whispered as the traitor collapsed. High in the citadel's inner tower, young Qasim and Suleiman stood guarded by the last of Zahir's men, blades still hovering near their throats. Malhan Khartun stood protectively before them, her voice trembling yet strong. "You will answer to Allah for this blasphemy. Touch them and your souls are damned forever." The boys, though terrified, held their heads high. "Our father will come," Qasim said firmly. "He always comes." Dursun reached the tower stairs first, leading a desperate charge of Karasi warriors. Arrows flew in the confined space, ending lives with deadly precision. "For the blood we have lost," he roared, his voice breaking with the memory of Damia. "For the future we will protect." He fought up the spiral staircase like a man possessed, blade and bow working in deadly tandem until he burst into the chamber where the princes were held. The final guards fell before his fury. Dursun dropped to his knees before the boys, pulling them into a fierce embrace. "You are safe, your father comes. The realm holds because of your courage." Outside, Orhan and a sporcher finally broke through to the citadel gates. The legate himself rode forward with his remaining elite, the golden cross gleaming obscenely against the flames. "This ends now, false king," he shouted. Orhan stepped forward alone, sword raised. "Then let it end between us. No more innocents need die for your holy war." The two leaders charged. Their duel upon the burning steps of the citadel became the final heartbeat of the night. Blades crashed with apocalyptic force. The legate fought with cold, calculated hatred. Orhan fought with the love of a father, the duty of a ruler, and the faith of an entire people. Steel sang. Sparks illuminated their faces. The legate landed a deep cut across Orhan's shoulder, drawing fresh blood. Orhan answered with a thunderous counter that shattered the man's guard and sent him crashing to the stone steps. As the legate lay defeated, gasping for breath, the remaining papal forces began to waver. Many threw down their weapons, realizing the city would not fall easily. Yet from the river came fresh horror. The Greek fire ships had repositioned, preparing one final, devastating barrage that would turn the entire heart of Bursa into an inferno. Orhan stood over the fallen legate, sword raised for the killing blow, when a great cry rose from the western walls. Fresh reinforcements, loyal captains who had been delayed by earlier skirmishes, poured through a hidden gate, slamming into the enemy rear. The tide had turned. But in the distance, the Greek fire ships prepared to unleash their final volley. Orhan looked toward the river, then back at his family, Esportia holding their sons, Turhan and Dursun rallying the warriors, Burhan Faladios standing guard. The city burned, the realm trembled, and the final dawn approached like the sword of fate itself. "Take the legate alive," Orhan commanded, lowering his sword. "We will use him to end this madness. All forces to the river walls. We stop those ships or we die trying." The night had reached its absolute limit. Flames consumed the horizon. The cries of the wounded filled the air. And as the first true light of morning touched the burning minarets, the final, most desperate battle for the soul of Bursa and the future of an entire people began in earnest. The war had come home, and it would not leave until every last ember of betrayal was extinguished in blood, fire, and unyielding faith. As the first true light of dawn clawed its way through the choking veil of smoke and flame that had swallowed Bursa whole, Orhan Saheb stood upon the blood-slick steps of the burning citadel, his sword still raised high like a banner of defiance against the very heavens themselves. The city he had sworn to protect was now a living inferno. Greek fire roared across the river in great, unstoppable arcs of liquid damnation, turning entire districts into seas of unquenchable flame. Ancient wooden halls collapsed with thunderous roars, sending pillars of sparks spiraling into the blood-red sky. The air itself had become a poison, thick with the stench of charred flesh, melting stone, and the desperate screams of those trapped between loyalty and annihilation. "Hold the river walls," Orhan roared, his voice a broken yet unbreakable thunder that cut through the apocalypse. "Turhan, take every rider still breathing and stop those ships. Burn them before they reduce our home to ash." Turhan, his face blackened by soot and streaked with blood, saluted with a bloodied fist. "As you command, Orhan Saheb, they will not pass while I live." He wheeled his horse and charged toward the river with the last of his elite riders, a desperate spear of vengeance galloping straight into the jaws of hell. Arrows whistled after them from papal positions along the banks, but Turhan rode as if death itself feared to claim him. In the grand square, Burhan Faladios fought like a man who had become the wrath of Allah made flesh. His sword moved in wide, devastating arcs, cleaving through the black-armored papal knights who tried to reinforce the legate's fallen position. "You brought fire to our city," he bellowed, his voice raw and terrible. "Now taste the fire you worship." A massive knight in ornate plate charged him. Their clash was cataclysmic, steel ringing against steel with such force that sparks lit the smoke like dying stars. Burhan fainted low, then rose with a strike that shattered the knight's helm and sent him crashing lifeless into the flames, consuming a nearby market stall. Dursun had reached the inner keep with the young princes, shielding Qasim and Suleiman with his own body as loyal guards formed a final circle around them. Malhan Khatun stood tall beside them, her voice steady despite the terror. "Your father fights for you. Stand brave, my grandsons. The blood of Osman does not kneel." Qasim, though trembling, gripped a small dagger. "We will not hide while he bleeds." Suleiman nodded, tears cutting clean lines through the soot on his face. "Tell him we are not afraid." A sporcher fought at Orhan's right hand like a queen of war, her sword moving with lethal grace as she defended the path toward the river walls. "They will not take our home," she cried, cutting down a traitor who tried to strike at Orhan's back. "Not while we still draw breath." Orhan glanced at her, their eyes meeting for one fleeting moment amid the chaos, a look that carried years of love, pain, division, and unbreakable unity. "Stay close to me," he said, voice low yet fierce. "Whatever comes, we face it together." The battle for the river became the soul of the final stand. Orhan's riders reached the banks just as the Greek fire ships prepared their deadliest barrage. Flaming projectiles arched high into the sky, trailing liquid death. Orhan spurred his horse straight onto the nearest vessel, leaping from the saddle onto its burning deck. "For Bursa," he screamed, driving his sword into the first enemy sailor he saw. His men followed, fighting hand-to-hand upon the decks as flames consumed the ships from within. One vessel exploded in a cataclysmic blast that lit the entire river in blinding white fury, sending burning debris crashing into the city walls. Orhan fought on, bloodied and singed, refusing to yield even as the ship beneath him began to sink in flames. From the citadel's highest tower, the remaining traitors watched with growing horror. Their leader, a captain who had once sworn loyalty to Orhan, turned to his men. "We are finished. The city burns because of us." Some threw down their weapons and begged for mercy. Others, driven mad by defeat, charged down to join the papal remnants in one final, suicidal assault. Orhan met them in the grand courtyard, his sword a blur of righteous judgment. The clash was intimate and merciless. Steel screamed against steel, men died with prayers and curses on their lips. Orhan Faladios joined him, their combined fury carving a path of death through the last wave of invaders. "This is for every brother we lost," Orhan roared. "This is for Demir Khan's soul. This is for the future we will protect." As the sun finally broke fully over the burning horizon, the tide turned decisively. The Greek fire ships, ravaged by Orhan's desperate assault, began to sink one by one, their deadly cargo exploding harmlessly in the river. The papal legions, seeing their greatest weapon neutralized and their legate defeated, began a chaotic retreat toward the western gates. Cheers, hoarse and broken, rose from the surviving defenders as they pursued the enemy through the flames. Orhan stood in the center of the ruined square, surrounded by his captains and family. A sporcher embraced their sons tightly as Malhun Khartoum wept with relief. Dursun knelt before them, head bowed. Orhan returned from the river, burned and bleeding but alive, dropping to one knee before his commander. Orhan Faladios planted his sword in the ground, breathing heavily as he surveyed the burning city. The legate, bound and on his knees, looked up at Orhan with defeated eyes. You have won nothing. Mori will come. The cross never forgets." Orhan looked down at him, then across the burning ruins of his beloved city. Smoke still rose in colossal pillars. Bodies lay scattered like fallen leaves. The great mosque stood damaged but defiant. His voice, when it came, was quiet yet carried the weight of destiny. "We have won today. Tomorrow we will rebuild, stronger, wiser, united. Take this legate alive. He will carry our message back to his pope. The house of Osman does not kneel, it rises from the ashes." Yet even as the first rays of true morning touched the minarets and the surviving citizens began to emerge from hiding to help extinguish the flames, a final scout rode into the square, his horse collapsing beneath him. The man crawled forward, gasping his final words before losing consciousness. "Orhan Saheb from the north, a new alliance forms. Surviving emirs, remnants of Demir Khan's old followers, and whispers that Nilafar has escaped her chains during the chaos. They march even now, seeking to strike while we are at our weakest." Orhan closed his eyes for a long moment, the weight of endless war pressing upon his shoulders like the hand of fate itself. A sporcher stepped closer, placing her hand upon his bloodied arm. Their sons looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes. Turhan, Dursun and Burhan waited in silence, ready for whatever command would come next. The night of fire had ended, but the war for the soul of the realm had not. Orhan opened his eyes, gazing toward the northern horizon where new storms gathered. His voice, when it finally came, carried the unyielding will of a man who had walked through hell and refused to break. "Then we prepare once more, gather every loyal soul, tend the wounded, bury the dead with honor, and when the next darkness comes we will meet it together, as one house, as one faith, as one people." The wind shifted across the burning city, carrying away the smoke and the echoes of battle, as the survivors began the long, painful work of reclaiming their home from the ashes. Yet in the distance, new fires kindled on the horizon and the drums of war, though faint, began their slow, inevitable rhythm once again. The epic struggle continued. Honor had been tested, betrayal had been answered, but the final chapter of this great tale still waited to be written in blood, fire, faith, and the unyielding will of those who refused to let their world fall into darkness. As the sun finally rose over the shattered spires of Bursa, it cast a merciless golden light upon a city that had been forged in fire and baptized in blood. The great mosque still stood, scarred and blackened but unbroken, its minaret partially collapsed like a wounded giant refusing to fall. Smoke rose in slow, mournful columns from 100 wounds across the city, entire quarters reduced to glowing embers, streets littered with the fallen, and the river itself carrying the burning debris of sunken ships like funeral pyres floating toward the sea. The air was thick, almost sacred in its heaviness, carrying the mingled scents of charred wood, spilled blood, melted iron, and the faint, lingering trace of Greek fire that refused to die even in daylight. Orhan Sahib walked slowly through the grand square, his boots crunching over broken stone and spent arrows, his sword still gripped tightly in a hand that refused to tremble. Behind him followed a sporcher, her arm wrapped protectively around young Qasim and Suleiman, the boys clinging to her as if she were the last solid ground in a world gone mad. Malhan Khatun walked beside them, her face streaked with soot and tears, yet her posture remained that of a woman who had seen empires rise and fall. Tarhan, Dursun, and Burhan Faladios formed a silent honor guard, their armor dented, their bodies weary beyond measure, yet their eyes burned with the quiet fire of those who had stared into the abyss and refused to blink. The legate knelt in chains before them, his golden cross now tarnished and bent, his once arrogant face pale with the realization of defeat. You have won nothing," he whispered hoarsely. "The Holy Father will send more. This is only the beginning." Orhan looked down at him, his voice low and heavy with the weight of every soul lost that night. "Then let him send them. We have faced fire from the sky and betrayal from within our own walls. We still stand. Take this man alive. He will carry our message back across the sea, that the house of Osman does not kneel, and that faith burned brighter than his Greek fire." A great broken cheer rose from the surviving warriors and citizens who had emerged from hiding. They gathered around their ruler, some weeping openly, others falling to their knees in prayer. "Orhan Sahib," they called, "the protector, the just, Allah has preserved us through you." Yet the joy was tempered by grief. Bodies lay where they had fallen, loyal guards, innocent merchants, mothers who had fought with kitchen knives to protect their children. The city had survived, but at a terrible cost. Orhan gathered his inner circle in what remained of the council chamber, its walls blackened but its great table still standing. Maps were laid out, stained with blood and ash. "The immediate threat is broken," he said, voice steady despite the exhaustion carving deep lines into his face. "But the realm bleeds. We must tend the wounded, bury the dead with honor, and begin rebuilding before the next storm breaks. Tarhan, secure the walls and the river. Ensure no enemy remains hidden within our gates. Dursun, take your karasi and sweep the northern approaches. Watch for any sign of Nilafar or her remaining followers. Burhan Faladios, oversee the distribution of food and water to the people. Let them see that justice brings mercy as well as steel." He turned to a sporcher, his gaze softening. "And you, my wife, you have fought as fiercely as any warrior this night. Stay with our sons, heal what was broken between us all." A sporcher met his eyes, her voice quiet but firm. "The division Nilafar sowed will not vanish with one victory. Your sons still carry scars. I will work to earn their trust as I have earned yours through fire." Qasim stepped forward hesitantly, looking between his father and a sporcher. "You fought for us even when we doubted." Suleiman nodded. "We saw you on the balcony. You did not run." The moment was fragile but real, a small bridge beginning to form across old wounds. Yet even as hope flickered, darkness stirred once more. A scout barely alive was carried into the chamber, his body burned and pierced by arrows. With his final breaths he gasped, "Orhan Sahib from the north, Nilafar escaped during the chaos. She rides with a new alliance. Surviving emirs, remnants of Damir Khan's followers and tribes who lost everything at the plateau. They march on the weakened passes. They say they will finish what the Pope started. They come for your head. And for the complete fall of this house." The words landed like a fresh blade. Orhan closed his eyes for a long moment, the weight of endless war pressing down upon him. When he opened them again, the fire had not dimmed, it had only grown deeper. "Then we have no time to rest. The realm has survived the night of fire, but another storm gathers. We will meet it not as a divided house, but as one forged stronger in these flames." He turned to his captains, voice rising with renewed command. "Tarhan, prepare your riders for a forced march north. Dursun, summon every loyal Karasi warrior. Burhan Faladios, fortify the city with those who can still hold a spear. A sporcher, you will help govern the rebuilding while I ride. Our sons will stay with Malhan Khatun under heavy guard. We end this cycle of betrayal once and for all." The days that followed were a blur of ash and determination. Citizens worked shoulder to shoulder with soldiers to extinguish the last fires and clear the rubble. Prayers rose from the damaged mosque at every hour, a defiant song against the darkness. Orhan walked among his people, offering words of comfort, promising justice, and reminding them that faith had carried them through the worst night in memory. A sporcher worked tirelessly beside him, organizing food distribution and tending the wounded, slowly winning the respect of those who had once doubted her. The young princes watched her with cautious eyes, the first seeds of acceptance beginning to take root. Yet on the fifth night, as Orhan stood upon the repaired battlements looking north, a rider arrived under moonlight. "They come, Orhan Sahib." Nilafar rides at their head with 5,000 spears. They have sworn to burn what remains of Bursa and install a new order under the shadow of the cross. Orhan turned, his face carved from stone and firelight. Then we ride to meet them before they reach our walls, gather the host, we end this shadow once and for all. The army marched north at dawn, smaller than before but hardened by fire and loss. Orhan rode at the head with a sporcher beside him, Turhan and Dursun flanking them, Burhan Faladios commanding the rear. As they crested the final ridge, the enemy host came into view, thousands strong, banners mixing old tribal symbols with the cross, Nilafar herself visible upon a white horse at their center, her face twisted with vengeful triumph. The two forces met upon the plains of destiny. The clash was cataclysmic, steel sang, arrows darkened the sky, flames rose once more as wagons burned and men died screaming. In the heart of the melee, Orhan finally faced Nilafar herself, their horses circling amid the smoke. "Your ambition has cost too many lives," he called. "It ends here." Nilafar's reply was a scream of hatred as she charged, dagger in hand. Their final confrontation was swift and merciless. Orhan disarmed her with a single powerful strike, bringing her to her knees before the gathered warriors. As she knelt in defeat, the remaining enemy forces began to break. Cheers rose from the Osman ranks, yet as victory seemed certain, a final scout rode in with devastating news. Orhan Sahib from the east, a new power rises, the true master behind the Pope's legions, a shadowy alliance of distant kings and fallen orders, has declared total war. They march with numbers beyond counting, and they have sworn that the House of Osman will be erased from history. Orhan stood tall amid the smoke of another hard-won field, his family and captains gathered around him, the weight of endless war upon his shoulders. He looked toward the distant horizons where new storms gathered, his voice rising like a prayer and an oath combined. "Then let them come, we have walked through fire, we have survived betrayal, we have risen from ashes before, we will rise again. The struggle does not end, it only reveals who we truly are." The wind carried his words across the plain as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows over the fallen and the victorious alike. The war for the soul of the realm had not ended. It had only entered its most dangerous and eternal chapter yet. And so the march continued, toward new fires, new betrayals, and the unyielding light of faith that refused to be extinguished, no matter how dark the night became.